Power of Hope Precure Full Bloom, or as I'll be calling it for the rest of this video, Otona Precure, is something of a fascinating creature when looking at the Precure franchise. It's another sequel season, but one that comes at things from a completely different angle than the other two did. Prior sequels were direct follow-ups that focused on the main cast of seasons that were popular enough to try and justify another round of toy sales. Otona Precure is instead a sequel that's coming over a decade after the original season it's following up on, something that is very much capitalizing on the nostalgia of those who watched as kids now being adults. Given that setup, the obvious thought is while this might keep things light, it's going to tackle some more mature topics from a more mature adult lens. It's certainly a worthy experiment, if nothing else, to see what can be done with a cast years down the line when they've grown up some more. Even as someone who just began watching Precure not that long ago and doesn't have the same nostalgia as some others, I was excited. I mean, I liked the S5 season a lot, even if Go-Go felt like it was really lackluster. These were characters that I really enjoyed for the most part. Add on that the girls from Splash Star were going to be there as well, and it was a combination of elements that I was happy to see revisited. The problem is that I walked away feeling pretty disappointed by the whole affair. It's a season that has a strong start, but falls off as it goes on, becoming something that, by the end, I wasn't even sure I liked all that much on the whole. I wish that wasn't the case, but here we are. Here's the thing. This season is quite different than all the ones I've talked about before now. Precure seasons are usually quite lengthy, leading to them being able to take a leisurely pace and build characters bit by bit, or meander around in episodic adventures along the way. Otona Precure isn't like that. It's only 12 episodes long, so pretty much everything has to serve the story in some way, because we're going to be constantly driving forward with this one and we have a limited time to cover everything. And because everything is vital this time around, I'm going to do something that I normally don't. I'm going to give you a rundown of everything that happens in this show from beginning to end. Along the way, we're going to collect up some of the things that are going to be what we talk about and put them in an imaginary corkboard to keep them organized. There are 16 separate topics that I intend to talk about, and the pins will be labeled by these topics. There will be more to say than what I put pins in, but these pins will be sorts of markers for us to mark the major moments that tie into these 16 ideas. By the end, this corkboard is going to be nice and full. For those of you that have watched the series, this recap might not be absolutely vital, but I still recommend watching it in full. A refresher never hurts, especially if you watched the series week to week when it was airing and haven't rewatched since. A lot happens in a short time here, much of it being content that I at least want to touch on, so having the plot fresh in your mind will make things a lot clearer. Episode 1. We start off looking at images of a young Nozomi to remind us what nostalgia we're supposed to have, while we have a voiceover about moving towards the future. We then see that our girl is all grown up, and so are her friends. Nozomi has indeed become a teacher like she intended to, and seems to be teaching at a higher elementary school level, somewhere in the 3rd to 5th grade if I had to hazard a guess. There's a quick moment that shows off a streaming/YouTube channel with some familiar looking faces. Put a pin in it, we'll talk more about them later. Anyway, Nozomi is big into her students following their dreams. She's cured dreams, so go figure. Which is why she gets super invested in one of her students who is sad. Said student loves being in the dance club, but her family is moving, so she's going to be transferring schools, and the school she's going to doesn't have a dance club at all. This is the start of the idea that when you're an adult, not everything can be solved with a wish, prayer, and dream. Put a pin in it. We get a glimpse at a character that looks like they'll be our main villain, and a light implication that they feed on or are related to apathy. Put a pin in it. Nozomi meets up with Rin so they can go to dinner at a small place that is owned by some Splash Star side characters. Put a pin in it. Rin isn't feeling very fulfilled at her work as an accessory designer since her designs and pitches are getting pretty regularly passed over. Put a pin in it. Nozomi finds out the reason that her student is moving is because her parents are getting a divorce, and there's not really anything Nozomi can do to stop that. Thankfully, the student has resolved that she'll just start a dance club at her new school herself. The next time that Rin and Nozomi go out for drinks, they run into everyone else and they all decide to go together. When they get to the bar, they find that Kurumi is there and already drinking on her own. She's working here in the human world to make herself into a better caregiver back home. Everyone catches up, and it seems like most of them have been out of touch for a little while. By this point, we have also found out that their transformation items just kind of vanished when they were no longer using them back when they were teenagers. While they're all having a good time and drinking, a monster appears before the father of Nozomi's student. Episode 2. We see Syrup vibing in the Cure Rose Garden and taking care of the flowers, confirming that we are going to be utilizing one of the better aspects from Go-Go. We also see that there is one black flower bud among the others. Back at the bar, the girls are all still drinking together, well, except Karin, because she's on call as a doctor. All of them discuss the work issues that they've been having lately, and we're just gonna stick a whole bunch of pins in this all at once. Everyone is getting visibly drunk. Urara holds her liquor the best, and Rin is a sad drunk. They all swap contact info, implying that they might not have kept in touch all that much after they got out of school. Stepping over into the land of mascots for just a moment, we learn that the black flowers that turned up in the rose garden are called time flowers. We'll talk about those later, so let's just drop a pin in that here. Out on the street, the shadows of people are stolen in order to become the monsters of the season. They collapse when this happens, seemingly unconscious. Nozomi uses herself as a distraction so that her students can get away unharmed, but her shadow is grabbed in the process. We see her mental space that occurs in this moment and her darkest thoughts coming to her, particularly the sentiment that if she can't do anything or make a difference, then she shouldn't even try. She resists this, the bud of the time flower blooms, Nozomi transforms, de-aging in the process. Put a pin in it. She then goes on an absolute rampage to take down these monsters. Episode 3. Karin is doing her doctoring thing. Her patient is a teenage girl who seems to have an attitude problem, some level of bitterness, and a resistance to even trying to do any physical therapy. Pin. Nozomi tells everyone about what happened to her the night before. One of the first instincts they have is to ask her about her skin was. Life in your 20s indeed. Karin's patient is still giving her the cold shoulder, even though Karin says that as she starts now, she can be up and running again like she was in just a year. The patient seems upset by that, and Karin doesn't understand why, but wants to get to the root of the issue. For a moment, she thinks she sees something in the hospital. Karin and Kurumi get dinner together, just the two of them, and Kurumi has a few too many drinks in the process, getting absolutely sloshed. Karin takes her back home with her to sleep it off, getting her into bed. Kurumi reveals that the reason that drink is her drink of choice is because it reminds her of the applesauce that Karin fed to her while she was sick in Yes 5. She then tells Karin she loves her. Pin. This reminds Karin of what made her want to be a doctor in the first place, and she heads back to work remotivated. She doesn't push the physical therapy, instead trying to bond with her patient by talking to her. We finally find out that the reason her patient had such a chip on her shoulder is that she was really into track, but if her recovery takes a full year, by the time she recovers she'll be graduated, unable to spend her senior year running track with her friends on the team. The bell in the bell tower rings, and shadows start appearing again. Karin gets cornered while checking on the people who collapsed. She goes to protect her patient while the shadow monsters try and get in her room and transforms the same way that Nozomi did. Pin. Kurumi, who got the feeling that something was wrong, comes running up and also transforms to get Karin out of pinch. The fight is over basically instantly. Pin. When telling the others what happened later in the bar, two people sitting nearby overhear and jump into the conversation. It's Saki and Mai from Splash Star, who everyone seems to know and be aware of. Episode 4. We see Bunby for the first time. He's now working for a property management company and inspecting some pretty rundown apartments for work. Seems that the business he started himself at the end of Go-Go must have failed along the way. Anyway, some shadows show up and chase him off. We get a glimpse into what some of the conversation the prior night was about after the two Precure groups reconnected. Mai is working as a graphic designer at a well-known agency, and Saki is working at her parents' bakery. Saki has also just gotten engaged to someone she met in culinary school. Meanwhile, Mai's boyfriend breaks up with her over text. Pin. However, even if her love life is going poorly, she seems to be happy and fulfilled at work, her attention to detail being one of the things that really helps her. It's revealed that the reason that Saki is in the Yes 5 city so much, despite the fact that she is working in her parents' bakery in her hometown, is because they launched a bread food truck, which she seems to have full control over and is really proud of. Pin. Kurumi and Nozomi talk about how the number of shadows that are being spotted just keeps going up, and it might be nice to have Saki and Mai on their side. It also turns out that Nozomi has been writing letters to Coco this whole time, but hasn't seen him in literal years. She wanted to be a fully fledged teacher and have achieved her dream before she saw him again. However, she is already a teacher and she still hasn't seen Coco. Big old pin. Mai takes some time off to help Saki out with the food truck, and they set it up at the apartment complex that Bunby was looking at the start of the episode. They're not getting any customers though, and the area seems kind of dead, so they end up just taking some time to talk instead. Mai tells Saki all about the problems she's been having with her boyfriend and reveals that she's not actually all that upset or broken up about the breakup. Saki affirms that it's perfectly fine for Mai to want to focus on herself and her career. Double pin. They are attacked by shadows that have been lingering around the apartments, but thanks to a phone call with Kurumi, Best Bird Syrup is able to fly in for the save. That night, back at home, Mai calls her boyfriend to really and officially break things off with him. Syrup delivers a letter to Coco about everything that's been happening. Episode 5. Nozomi is talking about the future and dreams and all that good stuff with her students. In doing so, she ends up talking about Coco, and in doing so, talks about him like he was so super inspirational as a teacher to her or something like that. Put a pin in it. That night at the bar, their strategizing is really kicking it up a notch as they start involving maps and things like that to plot where these things keep popping up. It's brought up that the first place that these shadows were really mentioned was on Dark Night Light, the stream that we as an audience very clearly can tell is run by Michiru and Kaoru, but the characters have no idea of this. Kurumi mentions she's asked for Coco and Nuts to come and take a look at things as well, which makes Nozomi really damn happy. Because Saki and Mai have no idea who Coco and Nuts are, someone mentions that Coco is Nozomi's soulmate. Pin. We get mentioned that Coco actually did used to visit, but hasn't come around since Nozomi graduated college. We also find out that she graduated college 4 years ago, so we're able to math out the ages of the S5 girls. Approximately, Nozomi and Ren are 25, Karin and Komachi are 26, and Urara at 24, give or take a year depending on time of year for birthdays and whatnot. Step sideways to the Palmier Kingdom, and it turns out that just Nuts is going to end up going because Coco is trying to deal with a water crisis that is a problem for both them and the Donuts Kingdom. We also get mentioned that the Time Flowers might be more sinister than they seem. At the bar, Kurumi and Komachi are chatting more about those Dark Night Light videos, and kind of mentions offhandedly that the spotlight on areas in the town or shopping district would really revitalize those areas. Nuts shows up to talk, and later Nozomi meets them there, but ends up disappointed that Coco didn't show up too. The bell tower rings, and more shadows start showing up. The group all start going around to see what's what, and Nozomi ends up in the alleyway where she met Coco, getting spirited away by the villain since she's on her own. There, she's shown a vision of herself stomping on the dreams of her students before the dark angelic figure we've seen all season shows up and introduces herself as Belle, the villain. She is indeed the villain of the story. She explains that the shadows are formed from people's hearts, and she's putting weak-willed and selfish people to sleep because they're not needed. Put a pin in that. Belle then summons the weakness in Nozomi's heart, which is that Nozomi is experiencing uncertainty because she doesn't understand why Coco won't come and visit her anymore. Pin on that too. Nozomi attempts to transform, but because her heart is wavering, her transformation item just vanishes on her. Back in the real world, we get a very short fight scene from Milk. Coco ends up showing up in the dimensional bubble that Nozomi is in, but feels powerless to actually fix any of the problems that are going on right now. Belle tells him that he is, and that he's terrible of his job of protecting the kingdom. Nozomi comes back with a somewhat weak speech about how much of a hard worker Coco is, and that he's actually a really great king, and she's super wrong. She is then able to transform again. Belle retreats, and the two of them are returned to the real world. Coco asks Nozomi if she's okay, and even when she starts crying and clinging to him, he won't hug her back. Pin of a lifetime. Episode 6. Rin's boss comes to her and tells her that because her work isn't getting picked up in the competitive environment of the office's in-house design competitions, she might be better suited in sales. Pin in that. In other news, the Time Flowers are blooming in response to the transformations of the girls. Rin and Karin talk for a little bit on their way home from the bar because Rin is headed home early to work on her designs and Karin has the night shift. They swap pleasantries about work, and Rin recommends Karin aromatherapy to help with her shifting sleep schedule. Work at home doesn't go much better for Rin, and we see her call her mother for a little grounding and comfort, as well as turn down her recreational soccer. The next day, Rin is in a taxi on her way to work, rehearsing her presentation in the back seat because she really needs to make this work. Glancing out the window, she sees what looks like a big dog-shaped shadow walking down the sidewalk. She blows this off as a figment of her imagination because they've only seen vaguely humanoid shadows up to this point, and she's pretty stressed out, so it might be just that getting to her. Pin. It's still something that's on her mind and getting to her because she's a little distracted and her presentation doesn't go nearly as well as it possibly could have. Kurumi, Coco, and Nuts are out doing some legwork and trying to track down any possible shadows when they get to talking. Kurumi encourages Coco to actually be with Nozomi and straight up says that she doesn't think he's considering Nozomi's feeling very much given his behavior. Turns out that Coco actually has come to the human world a whole bunch of times and just watched Nozomi from afar rather than talking to her in any capacity. Coco tells us that he knows he can't stay with her because of his job, and he also couldn't ask her to give up on her dream of being a teacher. Big pin. Rin and Karin take a trip together to the forest that's over by the Splash Shark town. They don't hear it, but as the audience we see that there are some land developers who are looking to not only take out a big chunk of the forest, but also cut down that big sky tree that was super important in Splash Star and was sort of the icon of that season. Put a pin in it. Rin admits that she can't bring herself to tell Nozomi that she prioritized her work over chasing down that shadow she might have seen, and that she straight up doesn't think she would be able to become a Precure again. They're attacked, and Rin ends up transforming after a little while after Karin does because she wants to be a person that Karin can lean on for support. Meanwhile, Nuts isn't sure if everyone transforming is a good thing, and Urara is starting to stare down her own professional struggles. Episode 7. We see Urara practicing her lines for a play she's meant to be in while she's working out. Turns out that the director thinks she needs to take a break and figure herself out. Urara is obviously worried that there is some level of risk she might end up getting replaced. Pin in that. Nuts is also pretty upset that Coco is refusing to talk about the future with Nozomi to the point of punching him in the stomach. Also, for the sake of comedy, we get to see Bunby trying to sell Coco an apartment. Turns out it's right next door to Nozomi's apartment, which Kurumi thinks is perfect. Syrup is coming back into the plot because we see him flying while singing along to one of Urara's songs, which segues us right into the fact that Urara has been so focused on theater that she hasn't been singing at all these days. But it's fine because we get a reunion of Yellow Girl and Orange Penguin. They're adorable together as they always were. They hang out and Urara is out in a disguise while simultaneously complaining that she doesn't really have a famous aura about her. At the bar, we see that she is dieting and then she sings for a baby to calm it down. Overall, though, girl just has a big inferiority complex lately. Pin that. Turns out that she's focused so much on acting because singing will just prove to be a distraction. They end up at a guitar shop for a bit, and it turns out that Syrup plays music for the plants because it's supposed to be good for them, and he was inspired to do so by Urara. They basically end up having jam sessions all week for Urara to get her groove back by the two of them writing a song together. Michiru and Kaoru hear them playing in the park and ask to be the ones to post their song online for their followers. The song seems to go semi-viral, but that attracts some unexpected hateful comments, which Belle uses to spark a new set of shadows, obviously. Syrup and Urara are attacked in the park by shadows, and Syrup tries to protect her. When he fails abysmally, Urara manages to transform and fully get her groove back. Later, her director outright says that giving her the time off really made a difference, and reiterates why she chose Urara for the role in the first place. Episode 8. We see Komachi working in the community garden, and her work there is really appreciated. She also had an essay published in the local paper recently. A kid asks her if her book can be found in the school's library, and Komachi doesn't think so. Her ideas notebook is entirely empty. Pin that. Komachi realizes that the shadows are only showing up in their town and just enough nearby area to justify them showing up in the Splash Shark town as well. She decides it might do some good to look into the town's local history and gets a lead on someone to talk to from the woman who appreciated her work with the garden. She heads off with Nozomi and Coco to talk to an older woman who turns out is Honoka's grandmother from the original series. She tells them all about how in the war, this area got bombed to hell and back until there was nothing left, except for the clock tower, whose bell continued to chime and give people hope. We're going to want a pin for that. Turns out that the flower bed that Komachi tends to was created in the rebuilding. Also, there's an angel on the bell in the clock tower, and shockingly, people call the angel Bell. They all head off to take a look at the clock tower together. The image of an angel on the bell sure does look a hell of a lot like the bell they know of, but gives off a completely different vibe to her. Once they leave, the bell rings and shadows start showing up. There's a fight. Komachi transforms after seeing the garden get all ripped up. Pin. Komachi wanted to defend the town because she herself is part of the story of the town. The time flower pulses, and then Nozomi collapses with Coco looking all worried about her. Episode 9. We open with Rin and Nozomi kicking ass, showing us that regular patrolling that they're doing that's only been implied or mentioned up until now. The flower does that thing to Nozomi again, and she gets lightheaded. Pin that. Meanwhile, Saki is hardcore focused on baking her bread, but it's not coming out just the way she would like it. This batch is too dry, for example. Later, she talks to Mai about how she is going to stay home and take over the bakery in the future. Her fiance is perfectly happy about that since he grew up in the city and would love to live in a quieter town like her hometown. In fact, since he's a cook, he plans on opening a restaurant somewhere nearby to the bakery. Saki, however, is implied to have some regrets about never taking chances to do something like study her craft abroad after a talk at the cafe brings it up. Put a pin in that. On the magical side of the world, we learn that the shadows are diversifying as bird shadows are now a thing. The voices of Dark Night Light sound familiar to Saki and Mai, but they just can't put their finger on it. Saki is looking at bread making courses that are available in France when she's interrupted by her fiancé texting her that they need to start touring wedding venues. Saki and Mai end up going to the Sky Tree to talk and think. The developers are back there again as well, but there is no interaction between these two groups. Mai can tell that Saki is down and picks up on the fact that she might want to go to France. Saki is feeling bound by the fact that she has adult responsibilities and can't just run off to do what she pleases. Mai says that she supports her and thinks that Saki's family would too. Pin that. Nearby, the developers get turned into shadows, and the shadows diversify more by showing us that big plant-like shadows are now going to be a thing as well. Saki and Mai are in danger but get saved by Michiru and Kaoru, along with a quick recap of who they are for those who might not have watched the original series. Their current deal is that they're going around and looking for all sorts of beautiful and fun things that they can share with people, just like Saki and Mai shared those sorts of things with them when they were younger, which ultimately led to their worldview changing and them falling in love with the Earth. Put a pin in it. Well, Belle's not interested in that, and uses the new monster to grab both of them and lift them in the air while showing them an illusion of nature and the city both crumbling away to make her point about how if you leave things up to humans, the world will one day fall to ruin. Pin that. Mai wants to try and turn into Precures to fight her, but Saki hesitates because she's an adult now. Mai gives her a pep talk about how being an adult doesn't mean that she stopped being Saki or something like that, giving Saki just enough motivation to go through with it, and they transform just like everyone else has. Pin. A fight ensues and does not last very long before they win. Later, Saki tells her family about how she actually does really want to study abroad. They support her immediately and unconditionally. Even Saki herself points out that this was an unclimactic resolution. At dinner, her fiancé supports her too, because just because she's getting married doesn't mean she needs to be completely tied down. At the bar that night, everyone is chatting, and it turns out the development project that would have cut down the Sky Tree is being called off due to protests from locals. We'll of course talk about this, so put a pin in that. It's decided that they'll all go back and look at the clock tower again, despite the fact that they literally examined it last episode and learned nothing. Nozomi gets up and collapses again as the time flower drops a petal like it's the rose in Beauty and the Beast. We get a reminder that the time flower is somehow sinister. You know it's actually serious this time though, since this is the third time Nozomi has collapsed, and this time she actually went unconscious. Obviously, pin it. Episode 10. Karin checks out Nozomi at the hospital, and despite her seeming pale and fatigued, she can't actually find anything wrong with her. Nozomi brushes the whole thing off, but Nuts tells her to stop transforming altogether. It turns out that the time flower is supposedly a countdown to disaster and wilts more as that disaster comes to pass. They're turning younger because of the flower's power, and that's not a natural thing. Nozomi is seeing a toll since she's transformed the most, and the flower might be counting down to her death. Pin and all that, obviously. Coco wants Nozomi to put her health before everything else, but Nozomi would rather take care of everyone else instead, since the Precure are the only ones who can fight the shadows. Everyone is still a little shaken about this news in general. Someone says that they finally figured out Belle is at the clock tower, which I am just going to put a pin in that so I can stay calm, because I lost my mind at this line the first time that I watched it. Later, Nuts tells Kurumi that she shouldn't be transforming either, and both of them run into Michiru and Kaoru. Michiru and Kaoru are trying to figure out if humans are the cause of things because shadows only come from humans, and some humans are callous people. Pin. There's mentions of extreme weather and how humans might be the cause. We see Belle and she says she has no time to waste and must stop the humans, so she rings the bell and releases a ton of ominous black feathers. A bunch of people get turned into or are attacked by shadows, including a guy littering in a river, a man standing next to a running truck, and a woman who takes a photo of some cute food but then won't eat it because she doesn't want to get fat. Pin. Saki and Mai go to the Sky Tree and there are shadows climbing all over it for some reason. Komachi and Karen see a bunch of people collapse with wandering shadows. Nozomi is back at home and has a nightmare where she's in the dark with a wilting time flower until Coco takes her hand. Turns out she collapsed again on the way home from the hospital. Nozomi finds out about how shadows are just everywhere and resolves that she has to fight even if it puts her health in danger because she wants to protect everyone. There's shots of all the other characters to let us know they've got the same mindset. Back with Kurumi, Nuts, Michiru, and Kaoru, Kurumi admits that there are indeed bad things in the world, but she wants to protect the world anyway because there are good things too. Nuts tells her with the strong will she has, it would be a waste for her to spend the rest of her life as a caretaker. Put a pin in that. Back with Nozomi and Coco, Coco understands Nozomi's feelings. He wants to support her even if they can't be together, and he cries while telling her not to die. He's powerless to do anything, but she's just happy to have his support. They agree to hear each other out when she gets back. Put a pin in it. Everyone transforms. Saki and Mai are taking care of shadows on the sky tree, and Nozomi gets a headache on a rooftop. The world is starting to go a little wonky, and we see Honoka's grandma sitting and looking at the sky to comment on the color she's turned. Honoka and Nagisa show up as a cameo standing behind her that we don't get a good look at, except for how they are somehow wearing the same clothes as they did when they were kids. Nozomi saves Bunbi before meeting up with the rest of the girls pretty quickly. Saki and Mai are also there, despite us seeing them at the sky tree just a few scenes ago. Everyone goes to the clock tower and they stand on the ground and yell at the building to try and talk to Belle. It works because she astral projects to appear in front of them. Belle, once again, talks about how she wants to get rid of all the fuelless humans. The Precure's god don't care and are going to take back the future for everyone together. Belle says she's protecting the town. She's actually from the future where the town was destroyed, and she shows them a vision of this, telling them that the town will be abandoned and destroyed by humanity. Put a pin in it. Episode 11, we're in the end game now. Nobody really wants to believe that the future Belle is showing them is true. However, apparently humans acting only according to their own desires will lead to air and water pollution, global warming, all the flowers and trees dying in a heat wave, and the town being hit by violent storms. All of this will make everyone leave the town. Put a pin in it. Belle once again reiterates that humans are selfish, and she thinks that stopping them will keep all that from happening. The city goes dark and shadows flood the streets. Michiru and Kaoru beat up with Coco and Nuts, and with the rest of the girls, a fight ensues. The shadows can now have gun hands. Shadows will continue to be born as long as humanity exists, and we hear shadows vocalize for the first time to display the apathy of humans. We can put a pin in that as well. The Cures are starting to believe that Belle is from the future, and what she says will eventually come to pass. Bunbi meets up with the mascots and Michiru and Kaoru, and they pretty much completely ignore that he's even there. The rest of them start talking about the nature of humanity, which we'll get into talking about later, so pin that too. Nozomi has another one of her fainting spells, but recovers enough to tell Belle that she can't protect the town by overrunning it with shadows. But when Belle pressures her for a solution of her own, Nozomi isn't able to come up with one. This, of course, just makes Belle even more mad, and she merges all the shadows together into one big mega shadow kaiju. It takes Nozomi a minute, but she finally makes the very obvious argument that if all the humans are gone, the town isn't the town anymore. In return, we get a vision of the town burning because Belle is really set on her idea of a solution. A big crack forms in the sky, and Belle releases the shadow kaiju out of her pocket dimension into the actual town. The Precure girls follow it as it moves through the street and absorbs every shadow that it comes across. Things escalate, and it begins absorbing buildings and trees as well, starting to destroy the town that Belle released it to supposedly save. Despite that being all her fault, she still does the mental gymnastics to decide that this is the fault of humans. Put a pin in it. The shadow is clearly just lashing out randomly at this point, despite Belle always having full control of them in the past, so of course it attacks Belle, which Nozomi saves her from. Nozomi then thanks Belle for telling her about the future so that they have a chance to make a better one. She then leaves and goes back to everyone else on the ground. They're all pretty unsure of what to do, so Nozomi gives a little talk about how they can do something and they just need to combine all their powers and it'll all work out. Put a pin in it. Some of the girls list off reasons why they have to save the future, like Karin having her patients to look after, and Urara has her acting dream, which needs the audience to come true, and Komachi's reason, well, let's just drop another pin down and we'll talk about that later. We get into the fighting, and Belle mentions that the darkness is going to envelop everyone. Gee, I wonder whose fault that is, Belle. A few more girls drop their comments about what they're fighting for, but the time flowers are dropping petals faster, so Nozomi has another one of her fainting spells and collapses. This allows us to end the episode by having Honoka and Nagisa show up to save her at the last minute while apologizing for being late. Put a pin in it! Episode 12, the final episode. Everyone is happy to see Honoka and Nagisa and seems to recognize them, implying that at least one of the crossovers between these three groups actually happened. We get back into the fighting and, well, I'm just going to drop another one of these pins down. We'll talk about it later. Regardless, they manage to kick the shadow back into Belle's pocket dimension for the rest of the fight to avoid the town seeing any more damage. Michiru and Kaoru follow to float as observers of the whole affair. The shadow kaiju tries to get out, but Hikari shows up just in time to seal the hole so it can't get out, but with herself on the other side so she won't be participating in anything else going forward. Pin that. The last we see of her is a quick moment where she asks Belle if this is what she really wants, getting into the idea of if it is right to hurt innocent people in the process while protecting the town. Meanwhile, back at the fight, Michiru and Kaoru start streaming the fight to literally everyone on all sorts of screens everywhere. It seems to have the opposite of the intended effect, though, since it just makes people who see it upset, feeding into the power of the shadows, since they don't think they can do anything about it. Before long, though, the people have a turnaround and start having an almost movie miracle-like moment by telling the Precure through their screens that they can do it. Bunby, watching all of this go down, goes and ruins it by telling these people this is no time to be doing that and they should do something for themselves, reversing the mood back to apathy again. Then we get Nozomi making a comment about what you do in the moment being what matters, so this feels like a lot of ping-ponging back and forth for a minute there. Long story short, though, if we do our best, we can reverse a hopeless future or whatever. Everyone starts throwing their biggest attacks at the kaiju at the same time. People in the town start vowing that they'll do their best themselves. There is a big final attack with the S5 girls, and the kaiju is defeated. Belle gets purified or something and vanishes after making a comment about how she still doesn't trust humans at all, but maybe everything will be okay if the Precure girls are around. This is where the real hard work starts to fix the future. Just as everyone is cooling off and catching up from everything, the time flower falls apart and Nozomi collapses again while remembering her promise to meet up with Coco after the fight. Oh no! 1 week later, the coma patients from the shadow incidents have recovered. Karin is doing her doctoring thing. Kurumi quit her job to become Prime Minister of Palmier. Rin has a new pitch her boss thinks will go over well. Urara is getting on stage and using her experience with Belle to adjust her performance of an angel. Saki leaves to study bread, and Komachi is working in the community garden. Michiru and Kaoru mentioned that the stream briefly went viral, but as time went on, people forgot about it, even if there are some who still take action. And we can just drop a whole bunch of pins down for all of that. Nozomi has been comatose since she collapsed. Coco visits her, and Karin has hope that she'll get better despite her boss having a lack of faith on that front. Coco tells Nozomi he wants to be with her and he loves her. Belle's bell shines with a rainbow while he's crying, and Nozomi magically wakes up and says she feels the same. Both of their jobs ask a lot from them, sure, but Nozomi thinks they can do their best and make it work if they have each other. Coco proposes. Pin! The time flower that is wilted dropped a seed which sprouted and started to grow again. Nuts comments that even though the flower has been called sinister, maybe that's not actually the cause of things and it's more a warning so we can steer clear of dangers. So the time flower is Mothman, is what I'm hearing? Put a pin in it. We do not see Honoka and Nagisa again. There is implications that give the impression they're doing something environmental in the Amazon and Arctic. The regular Precure drinking parties are now a meeting to help the future or whatever. We get glimpses of what everyone is up to after the series wraps, which we can talk about later when they're relevant. The biggest one being Nozomi and Coco's wedding, where he is in mascot form. We see Nozomi teaching again, where she has her students close their textbooks so they can use their minds to come up with solutions for a better future themselves, because it's not a faraway thing for a stranger to deal with, but about them. A lovely ending sentiment, which is undercut by the final shot of the series being someone littering a can while saying they couldn't care less about the future and the can being zapped like when Belle forms a shadow. And that's it. That's the end of Otona Precure and everything that happened before that point, so we can all be on the same page with all this before getting into discussing all these pins that we shoved into my pin board here. When I was first planning out how to talk about this series, there were even more, but through combination, simplification, and plain old rethinking connections, we've gotten down to a narrowed field of 16 topics, which I have split into 2 further categories. These 9 pins are the character pins, where we'll delve into how each of these were handled, their arcs if they had any, and what changed for each of them since their original incarnations. These other 7 are the plot and production pins, where we will talk about everything that isn't really specific to a character, where things are a little more overarching. Yes, I know Belle is in there as a character. While I will be talking about her as a character in that section, we're also going to be talking about what she represents narratively and her function in the story. So it felt like it made more sense to talk about her here in these broader categories. We'll start with our character pins and then work our way towards the broader concepts and plot elements. So let's start taking these pins down one at a time. Nozomi was maybe my favorite character out of the original Yes 5 crew. She was one of the ones that I found more relatable, and we got to spend a lot of time with her. She had the added benefit that her flaws were depicted as places to grow from and not something to just make jokes about. She experienced some flanderization and sidelining when it came to Go-Go, but she was still treated like a hero at the end of the day and had the foundation built in Yes 5 to fall back on as the core of her character. She was one of the ones that I was most interested in seeing grow up and deal with adult life as well. I know several people in my life who went into education, and I currently live with a special education teacher. Obviously, the culture around education in Japan and America are very different, but one thing is true no matter where you are. Teaching can be a hard job that demands a lot from people who step up to the plate for it. Now, I think I should be clear that I never expected that this show would go terribly deep into the workplace drama or hardships for any of the characters. A series like this one is going to try to be an escape of sorts for young adults watching it. When you are trying to get an escape from your daily life, the last thing you need is to be reminded of that project deadline you have coming up, you know? Additionally, each of these characters went into incredibly different fields of work. Focusing completely on the workplace drama for any of these would mostly cut the other characters out from proceedings, and a lot of the appeal of these characters was their interactions. If you're having trouble at work, the most your friends who don't work there can do is commiserate with you and be an ear to listen to your troubles. I expected that more of the focus would be on either internal or interpersonal adult struggles rather than workplace-specific ones. So I am not upset that we didn't get into the nitty-gritty of Nozomi having to suffer through lesson planning after work. All that being said, it is a little disappointing to me that after the first 2 episodes, Nozomi's work didn't play much of a factor in her life all the way until the final episode. I think a lot of that comes down to the way that this series is structured and functions. The series has a core cast of 8 Precure girls that are all deserving of an equal amount of focus. Now, an ensemble cast of even 6 main girls isn't really an issue in one of the mainline seasons of the series, since they have nearly 50 episodes apiece that they can spread screen time around for each of these cast members. If they do that well is up to each season, of course, but you certainly can't say that they didn't have the time available to them at the start. On the other hand, Otona Precure is only 12 episodes long. If it gives each of the Precure girls even just 1 episode to themselves, that already eats up 8 episodes, or 2/3 of the series. That's what the series chooses to do, but episode runtimes have to be shared with the main plot at the same time, so not everyone really gets to have an episode all to themselves. Now, even if Precure are ensemble casts most of the time, there is usually one girl that is the designated main character of a season, the one that gets a little more focus and spotlight than the others. Nozomi was that for her first season, so she gets some extra focus this season as well, getting 3 episodes that are mostly about her compared to just 1. But even that isn't as much as you'd think it is. Nozomi is undoubtedly the lead for the first few episodes, but given the way that the series is establishing a new status quo, a lot of the first episode is spent getting us caught up with where all our characters are all these years later. The first episode does have some Nozomi focus and set the story with her student up, but it's a little more paid off in the second episode since the first is catching up with everyone else as well. So it might be better to consider that spread of 2 episodes to be about equivalent to the 1 episode the rest of the cast ends up getting. So in that plot, we see what Nozomi is like as a teacher, a fairly standard positive influence on her students that cares about them and their problems personally. Honestly, par for the course for the way that Precure tends to depict these kinds of adults. Just hitting a little different since we now know her and she's not a background or side character in the story of some children. My biggest fear was that they were going to depict Nozomi as being a character who hadn't grown up at all since her Precure days, and there was going to be something about her needing to let go of being a Precure and grow up to face adult life head on. Now, there's nothing wrong with needing to grow up and face adult life. We all have to do it at some point, but having that growing up being leaving her Precure adventures behind in the past is what would have been the problem element of that. Would have been the problem was the implication that you have to leave childish things in the past, and that being a Precure was one of these childish things. I know it's a bit of a cliche at this point to bring up the Tolkien quote, but I'm gonna do it anyway because I do genuinely love it. Critics who treat adult as a term of approval instead of as a merely descriptive term cannot be adult themselves. To be concerned about being grown up, to admire the grown up because it is grown up, to blush at the suspicion of being childish, these things are the marks of childhood and adolescence. And in childhood and adolescence, they are, in moderation, healthy symptoms. Young things ought to want to grow, but to carry on into middle life or even into early manhood, this concern about being adult is a mark of really arrested development. When I was 10, I read fairy tales in secret and would have been ashamed if I had been found doing so. Now that I am 50, I read them openly. When I became a man, I put away childish things, including the fear of childishness and the desire to be very grown up. So the really childish mindset is the idea that you can't enjoy things from your childhood or that a child might enjoy because they're not something that is meant for or created for adults. Am I going to claim that I still love Barney like I did when I was 3? No. Barney might be something I enjoyed as a kid, but it's not something I carried with me into adulthood. However, adulthood only gave me more of an appreciation for Avatar: The Last Airbender, for example. That is a show that was made for children, but you can still love and appreciate it as an adult. And if you want an example that is really exempt from the possibility of nostalgia goggles, Bluey is an absolutely wonderful children's show that I find absolutely delightful as an adult. Feeling like I couldn't enjoy it because it was made for children is itself the childish mindset. Precure, similarly, is a show that is aimed at young children as its primary audience, but as someone who only started watching it as an adult, I find it to be very enjoyable for the most part, and there is a lot that I have gotten out of it. If the show had tried to say that Nozomi had to leave Precure in the past because it was something that was for children, I could only have called the creators hypocrites. Because you can't have that be the message of your series while also trying to market explicitly to an adult audience that grew up watching the original series as children. I won't say this is something that was entirely missing from the series as a possible undercurrent, but I can say I don't think it was their intent to say that Nozomi needed to let go of the Precure stuff and move on. Is there a moment where she does a Precure pose as an adult and it's cringy? Yes, but that's clearly a fun little joke and not some statement about the state of her as a character. Like, she got caught up in a daydream about how it might be easier to help her student if she was a Precure for a second and said something out loud rather than just in her head. Happens to the best of us. But also, like, being a Precure wouldn't solve this problem because magic heroes can't just fix everything with a snap of their fingers. Nozomi's issue here is that her student, Rumi, is moving out and will be changing schools to one that does not have a dance club because her father's company is failing, which is upsetting since that was her activity of choice and she really loved it. And this has Nozomi running up against a problem that she doesn't really have any means to fix, but that's not to say she doesn't try. She tries to see if there's any sort of scholarship situation that could help. There isn't, and her superiors rightly point out that making one for the sake of this one specific student would obviously look like favoritism. Nozomi wants to help, and we can understand why, but at the same time, she can't just run around and move heaven and earth for this one kid, because what happens when it's another student next week, and another after that? When that fails, she does research into options outside the school's limits, finding subsidies that her family could make use of and programs that can help with unemployment. She gathers all this up and takes it to Rumi's father, only to find out that there's a divorce involved here too. And this guy is clearly not exactly at his best at the moment, getting belligerent with Nozomi and asking if she has some solution that could fix his debts or failing business, telling her to get out when she doesn't. And I don't think this is entirely that the options that Nozomi came up with won't help at all, but I think it's more that they wouldn't do enough to offset the issues that this family is going through. He also talks about doing things all on his own, and we don't see the entirety of this conversation, so it's possible that he's simply unwilling to use these programs out of pride or not wanting what he might see as a handout, even if it might be to his benefit. I appreciated this because as good as it can feel to help someone, hard work and gumption can't solve every problem. Sometimes things are just out of your hands. I love that Nozomi tried, but I also love that she failed. It's pretty even-handed in that she can find something that might help, but that doesn't mean that it will be as much as they need, and she can't make someone accept her help. She can't force this father to accept, even if she wants to help her student. Where this falls flat, though, is the way that they resolve things between her and the student. Nozomi ends up apologizing that she couldn't do more, but the student has already come up with her own solution in the meantime, so everything is all good, even if it is not by the intended path that Nozomi came up with. Now, coming up with an alternative solution to the ones initially tried, where this girl starts a dance club at her new school instead of staying at the current school, isn't the problem. I think that's actually a really nice, realistic take on how to resolve this, given the way things were laid out for us. It's a nice show of how it's okay to make the situation work for us rather than trying to force the situation. My problem is that Rumi is the one that came up with this all on her own, so Nozomi doesn't really have any closure to her journey in these episodes. Now, maybe that's realistic too. We don't really get closure always in real life after all, but this is a constructed story, so the goal should be to be at least a little narratively satisfying. Nozomi tried to help her student, but never found a solution for her. I'm all for kids figuring out solutions to their own problems, but in this, where the story is about Nozomi and not her student, it might have been nice if Nozomi had the realization that there are other ways to approach the problem and suggested this to Rumi. Nozomi would have grown a little and changed in perspective then. As it is presented in the series, Rumi comes up with this all on her own after Nozomi tells her not to give up in the first episode. And I can see what they're trying to do here in having Nozomi's advice from the first episode be what brings Rumi to her conclusion, but it doesn't fully work, at least not for me. Once again, this is about Nozomi, so she should be the one having the arc here, but also because don't give up is some of the most generic advice that this little girl could have gotten from anyone. It doesn't feel like Nozomi actually said anything revelatory to this child that prompted this, just gave a generic platitude that she could have spouted back in the original series. Don't give up is a great idea and all, but this is a series made for adults, so I would hope to see a little more out of it, you know? My bigger problem with Nozomi, though, is while I still have fun with her as a character and don't think the series is trying to say that she hasn't grown up at all, she doesn't feel like she's grown up. And this might be a symptom of her being the protagonist of what is still a magical girl show, to be fair, but really rears its head in her other episode, episode 5. Now, much of this episode is more to deal with the Cocozomi thing, which I will get into more when we actually talk about it, but when talking about Nozomi-specific stuff here, it just doesn't feel very matured. A lot of what we're dealing with here when Belle shows her illusions is very simplistic with easy answers. Her early season episode had her dealing with the fact that she couldn't do anything to make the situation with her students sort of go away and let things go on as they had up until now. So when she got touched by the shadow, she was confronted with her darkest thoughts about that if she couldn't do anything to help someone, then she shouldn't really try in the first place. And this connects. Like, there was a solution that they got to there in the end, but at the same time, she didn't really do anything that brought them to that point, and the solution they came to wasn't perhaps the happiest one they could possibly get. Like, yeah, the girl has hope for her new school and a possible new dance club there, but at the same time, even if she does that, she will be leaving all her current friends and dance club members behind. half the fun of an activity can be the people you do it with. So having Nozomi have this feeling where maybe she shouldn't have tried if she wasn't able to get the best possible solution, then she rejects that because even if it doesn't work out, she might have regretted not trying more, is perhaps not the most mature idea in the world, but it does have some complexity to it, which I appreciate. Comparatively, Belle's illusions in the 5th episode are so blunt that they could have been ripped right out of a core Precure season. Nozomi in her classroom telling her students that dreams are stupid and a waste of time, like, that is so obviously not true and blatant that it's not really worth the words it takes to refute. Nozomi is literally a character who has made her dream come true by becoming a teacher. Maybe this is meant to connect with her doubts about her relationship with Coco, but if it is, the connection isn't very well established, making this feel like a weak moment. The only other thing she refutes from Belle is related to Coco, basically to prop him up after Belle preys on him feeling like he's worthless because he can't single-handedly fix all the problems in his kingdom. And the little speech she gives there is another one I found really weak, essentially a I know him better than you do, so nuh-uh type of deal. Basically, he's a hard worker and a great king, which is just whatever. And another moment that feels a little like lip service that could have been ripped straight out of Yes 5. It's not that these are completely bad moments, but more that it doesn't exactly feel like she has a more mature take on things than she did as a kid. Could an adult say these? Sure, but it doesn't really convince me that Nozomi has grown up like I think the series wants to. This all really comes to a head for me with the finale of the series, when everyone is feeling down and Nozomi rouses them with a basic, we can do it if we work together speech, where she has no plan and is fully hyped up on the idea that friendship will save the day because it did it before and it will do it again. And yes, that did work, and we know it will work because we have genre awareness, but it really is something that feels like it would come out of the mouth of a teenager. I mean, technically it is because Nozomi is de-aged for this scene, but you know what I mean, right? Like, the ideas themselves aren't a bad thing, but the way she's talking feels immature for the adult perspective that she should have. I don't feel like I'm watching the Adult Precure series anymore, but instead, Yes 5 or Go-Go. Don't get me wrong, I like Yes 5 and base Precure well enough, but when you're doing a series about the Precure girls as adults, I think it would have done them well to make Nozomi feel more mature. There's nothing wrong with her being optimistic and hopeful, but these are the same words that we would hear from Precure protagonists all the time. Protagonists much younger than Nozomi. It's not that they're wrong, but that I'd hope this series about adults might give us something a little different, differentiate itself from the other seasons in more than just the lack of a school setting. The rest of Nozomi's screen time is really eaten up by her relationship with Coco, but that's something I would like to have us get into a little later, so we'll leave our discussion of Nozomi there for now. I still love her as a character, I just wish the plotting and dialogue of the show could have given me something more to her, a new angle or dimension to match her new age. Kaoru was always one of the characters in her series that was the most put together and stable, and that's continued to be the case this time around. She doesn't really have any turmoil that she's working through or anything like that. Most of my notes about her were something along the lines of, yep, she's still doing her doctor thing. The closest we get to her having any issues in the workplace is when she mildly disagrees with another doctor that seems to have seniority over her in how to handle one of her patients. When Nozomi's in her coma, she has a disagreement with the same doctor, but at that point, I can't really blame the doctor because he has a patient who is in a coma with no observable medical cause. Kaoru knows why she's like this, but she can't just straight up tell the guys that the coma was caused by magic. Even the episode that's focused on her doesn't delve much into her having some kind of problem that is personal to her to deal with. It's about her dealing with a teenage patient who isn't willing to give into the treatment that she needs. This is overcome by her bonding with the girl enough that she can settle her concerns through conversation and accept the help that Kaoru is trying to give her. And to be clear, It is a plenty fine of a plot for an episode. It's pretty sweet, and I'm glad to see that Karen is good at her job and connects with her patients, a hope that we would have for her after her original Precure run. However, as the only episode that focuses on Karen, it is a little disappointing that this is what we got. If this were a longer season and this was one of a few episodes about Karen, I don't think I would have much of a problem with it. But when this is some of the very little explicit focus that we get on her, that feels like it could have come from any medical drama in the world, that is a little disappointing. It's one of the things where there's nothing explicitly wrong with what we're given. I find myself wishing that we could have done something that spoke to her as a specific character a little more than this stock plot. Even when she ends up transforming, it's not for any reason that feels like an internal struggle for her. She just wants to protect her patients. That is definitely a noble thing for her, but I have no reason to believe the events of the episode before that point influenced her choice to do so. Surely this teenager isn't her only patient at the time. Given what I know of Karen's character, this seems to be something that she would have done to protect the hospital patients in general. So what is it about this patient that made her so impactful to Karen? I can't say for sure. She was the one that was widening the perspective of the patient, not the other way around. And that's obviously because she's the adult in this situation. She should be the one that is opening the eyes of the youths. But the problem is that it makes Karen's relation to this girl about reflecting on her past. It's something that is about her looking back to help this girl look forward, about how her friends helped her in the past, not the present. Karen isn't making use of the present or having her present changed. I don't want to speculate too much on what could have been, since I want to meet the show where it is rather than where I would prefer it to be. However, I can't help but consider what it might have been like if, instead of Karen's patient in this episode being a teenager, it was someone older than her, perhaps even elderly, and it wasn't about trying to get this person to do physical therapy, but maybe about confronting something difficult. Perhaps Karen has to give a patient bad news about their diagnosis and just can't figure out how to tell them they're in for a tough road ahead. Or maybe an elderly patient who is coming to their end, and Karen transforms to fight off shadow monsters so she can give that person whatever extra minutes or days she can. Hell, throw in something about how his family is going to visit him in the morning and they can't do that if he's gone or something like that, if you really need it. I think that there were times that Precure wasn't sure what to do with Karen in her original series, but because of the fact that there was more time there was more room to play around with her and allow her to discover things about herself that this series just doesn't have time to bother with. There was also more room for her to be part of the stories of other characters. The only other character that she plays a part in the episode of this season is Rin's, and even then, she's not in most of that episode, nor does she do terribly much in it that is interesting. In fact, most of Karen's screen time outside of her episode is just her being a good and dependable friend like she always was. She checks out Nozomi when she starts collapsing to try and figure out if she's okay or not. She makes sure that Kurumi has somewhere safe to stay when she's had a little too much to drink one night. She spends the whole season taking the back seat unless someone needs a medical check, really. She ends up feeling more like a background character as a result, a lead that doesn't always quite feel that way. The Applejack of the cast. And sure, not everyone can be the highlight of the series, but I think the reason that it stings with Karen is she was one of the most robust characters in Yes 5. She got 2 mini arcs that season, one early on and one in the back half, that were both about opening up and broadening her world. And that show wasn't above showing her falling back into bad habits when stressed out either. In comparison, this version of her feels like she's been smoothed down somewhat, made into just the dependable friend because we don't have time for her to be anything else. For as much as I wish we had more screen time for just about all the characters, Kurumi is really the one that gets it the worst because she doesn't even get an episode to herself. At most, she gets a scene or two in another character's episode. She lives more as a side character rather than one of the core cast. And I know that she wasn't exactly always a main character, but she was a mascot for half a season and then a lead for the sequel season. To see her nearly set aside like this is really odd. She's the only Cure who is in the bulk of the season to not get an episode to herself. Saki and Mai aren't even from the season that this show is technically a follow-up to, and yet they get their own episodes, so what gives? I think this is just a case where they didn't know what to do with her. She already didn't get the most robust stories in her other seasons, spending one as a shit stirrer and the other season being one that lacked character growth for pretty much all of the characters. Theoretically, she should be back in her magical mascot land working as a caregiver, given how long she was in training for her initial appearance. However, she's taken up office work in the city for the sake of it, making her a better assistant. Which, that's a good as reason as any for her to be back in town, I suppose, but at the same time, given that she was in apprenticeship in her original series, it feels very strange for her to still be undergoing training like a decade later. I know that some professions have ongoing professional development and education, but just something about the way this was worded in the show didn't give the impression that this was a break from her regular work to hone her skills, but instead something she was still doing to prepare for that job. I don't think that was really meant to be the implication here, but it was the vibe that things gave off. Her role in the story ends up not being that big in the grand scheme of things. She spends some time with Karen to keep up the tradition of that relationship being one of the cuter ones, but she ends up spending most of her time outside work or at the regular gatherings at the bar with Coco and Nuts once they are introduced back into the story. There are implications that this small group is going around and investigating off-screen, but we don't get to see much of that, which can leave it feeling like Kurumi really isn't doing anything. Look, as much as I love Saki and Mai and want them to get their flowers since their season can fly under the radar, and the fact that Mai's episode is one of the better ones of the season, I almost wish they had been cut so Kurumi could get an episode to herself. She was a big part of her season, so to not give her a real moment to shine feels like they're neglecting her just because she can turn into a pink puffball sometimes. And I think it's a shame because she seems like she's in a pretty terrible work situation, which has plenty that can be mined for drama. Her bosses are callous and demanding, but we never see her have to navigate that in any way. If anything, it's used for comedy of her getting upset with them when she's in private or with her friends and little else. I know the show is something of an escape from adult problems in some ways, but to set up a situation like this that seems ripe for a good character story and then to do nothing with it feels like a wasted opportunity. The season ends with her just telling her boss that she's off to become the prime minister and then promising her fellow magic creatures that she will make a government for and by them, which feels like it comes a little out of nowhere. Nuts tells her at one point that she would be wasted as a caretaker with how much spirit she has, but it's hard to see a solid through line between that and deciding she's going to be a prime minister. I get the feeling that they wanted to give a definitive sense of closure for her, just like everyone else, and that was more of a complete end for her than ending the series with a whole wide world of possibilities open to her. It's also just a little weird that out of nowhere she's like, I'm going to reform the government! And everyone just sort of goes along with it, despite the fact that they live in a world where they have magically ordained kings. She's got a strong personality, though, so maybe that's why she got away with it. I just wish there was something more of an arc with her regarding this. As things stand now, she's treated more like a side character who gets added into the fights for some more firepower. To be fair, she gets more respect from the series than Hikari did, but given that Hikari got literal crumbs, that's not saying all that much. Mai's episode is perhaps the best one-off story in the series, and I really love that for her. It's not like Mai hasn't been given content before. She was one of only 2 leads on Splash Star after all. However, even back then, she got a little less of the focus, so having her moment in the spotlight come before her partner in this series was nice. I also personally appreciated that the transformation of both of them was held back until Saki's episode. It gave this one time to breathe and let the focus be completely on Mai's experience, rather than somehow having to make that experience also tie into an emotion that would trigger the capability to transform for them. Mai's episode, at the core, is really about how it's perfectly fine to focus on yourself, and that you don't absolutely need to have someone else in your life for you to find meaning. And this is discovered through her dealing with a breakup, one that she realizes she is not having the emotions about that society might expect her to. Her boyfriend breaks up with her over text, and instead of being upset about it, she's more concerned about the fact that she's not upset. She doesn't actually need him at all, as nice as dating someone was. She's plenty fulfilled in other aspects of her life and doesn't need a relationship to complete her. She's happy and doing well at work, she has her friends, but none of that keeps her from comparing her life progress against that of others. And that is such a common adult experience. Sure, making progress yourself is exciting, but when you're not making progress in the same ways or at the same pace as other people, it can be hard. Even if you're personally happy, there can still be that itch in the back of your mind that maybe you're doing something wrong, that there's something not right about what your goals are. And I get the feeling that this might be something that would impact Mai even more, since she's living in a culture where part of adulthood is submitting to conformity on some level. Yet at the same time, it's good to see that Mai is happy. She's content at where she is at in her life, even if she can't help but compare herself to her best friend. Anyone would find it a little bit rough to get broken up with at the same time that one of your closest friends is getting ready to get married. If nothing else, Mai just lost her wedding date. Still, it's clear that this guy wasn't the one for Mai. For one thing, like I said, she wasn't all that terribly broken up about the relationship ending, but I also get the impression that she might have already been losing investment in it, which could have been a contributing factor for the breakdown. And that's not something that she's wrong for, to be clear. It's a natural path that some relationships take, unfortunately. Sometimes your investment in someone just wanes over time. One detail I really love is the way that the series tries to visually show that this guy wasn't it. There's a moment where Mai is sitting on her phone, unsure of how to respond to what's going on, what she should say to a breakup being initiated in this way. She's eventually interrupted and pulled away to do something else in the meantime, but there's this brief shot that I like showing her hand holding her phone. She has one of those rings on the back of your phone that helps you not drop it, and her finger is stuck through it. However, it's quite big around her finger. The ring is too big. It's not the right fit, just like this guy isn't the right fit for her. It might not have been an intentional visual metaphor, but it definitely still works as one. Her resolution with this mostly comes through a conversation with Saki, but that's okay because what she really needed was reassurance rather than to be told what the right thing to do was. She already knew what felt right for her, but because what felt right was a little out of step with the rest of the society, it could be a little hard to fully commit without some outside reassurance that it was really okay. And I get that. There are times in your life where you can feel like you know the way things should go, but there's always that fear that to commit to that feeling could alienate those you care about. Having the support of at least one person can be a bit of a game changer, and since none of Mai's family is going to show up at all this season, it makes sense to use Saki as that person for her. However, I think part of the reason that Mai's story is so strong is because it's not connected to any of the Precure stuff. Many of the other characters are meant to have these sorts of personal revelations that lead into them becoming Precure again, but since she is part of a duo and the show is holding back on their transformation until the second character gets her big moment, it leads to Mai getting to have her plot exist entirely outside the context of becoming a Precure again. It allows her episode to be about her without that magical stuff getting in the way, also helped by it being earlier in the season when the core plot is still somewhat coming together and we spend more time on the character stories rather than the plot. And all that makes her plotline feel just a touch stronger because she has her emotional resolution, then she and Saki are attacked. Her emotional catharsis doesn't have to happen in the middle of or on the brink of a fight, so it just gets to be without any real emotional distractions. Mai was always the more solid and collected one in her original season, so it's good to see her still be holding it together pretty well this time around. I don't have any major complaints about how she was handled. Her episode was really solid, focused in on her relationship in a more mature way than I would expect from a season of core Precure, and connected us with her as a character. Overall, a real bright spot among some of the flops of the season, and one of the parts of the show that I just have praise for the handling of. It's a shame that she gets little to no attention from the show after this point, but as we've been over, the show hardly has runtime to give attention to a character outside their personal episodes or scenes. Rin is a character I did like quite a bit in her original season. Even if she didn't get a ton of time to personally shine, when the focus was put on her, they were really solid episodes that tended to highlight her personal struggles that came with the strong sense of personal responsibility that she had and her passions. Otona does try to pay a little service to that content by showing us things like how she's still playing sports in a recreational capacity and juggling her work-life balance better than she probably would have when she was in middle school. Though I suppose that's to be expected now that she's grown up some. If you had asked me before the season began what character was going to have the plotline about not being professionally satisfied, I wouldn't have picked it to be Rin, honestly. I thought we might see Karen struggling with there not always being a happy ending in medicine, or Urara having trouble with the competitive nature of the acting world now that she's a grown woman and not a cute kid anymore. However, in hindsight, it makes sense that Rin might have some struggles. Her work is a more competitive one as well, even if she has secured a job. That doesn't mean the competition is over, since she's not the only designer at her company and is facing in-house competitions for whose design is going to actually get made. Competitions she is not doing terribly well in. It's to the point where her boss is starting to suggest she might be a better fit for another role in the company, which, while harsh, is a kinder option than just letting her go from the company altogether, at least. Here's the thing. Rin isn't fulfilled at her job, but it's not because she doesn't enjoy designing anymore. It's because her work isn't being recognized. Go through that over and over and over again, and yeah, it's going to start to weigh on you. And when she's basically being told that her next shot might be the last one she gets, I don't blame her for stressing herself out in the way she ends up doing. She even calls her mom for some support, which, as someone in her 20s with a big girl adult job, yeah, I've been there. Hell, when I started my second job as a side gig, I still had to call my mom for a reminder on how to fill out my W-4, even though I had done it right in the first place. I am a grown-ass woman who has a decently solid grasp on being an adult at this point, but there's just something about being assured you're doing things right by your mom that always makes things feel a little better, you know? Or maybe that's just me. There is something that bothers me about Rin's plot in this episode, though, and that's the way that it handles her transformation and seeing this shadow that she ignores. Now, it's not shown that Rin pulled an all-nighter before she got into the cab for work, but she's clearly pretty frazzled when she does. At the very least, she's been hyper-focused on perfecting this presentation and is stressed out. So when she sees this shadow that looks like a dog, she writes it off and puts it out of her mind, only for it to be basically confirmed what she saw later. And she really beats herself up about this, and I get that she might feel bad, but I also think she gives herself too much of a hard time. This was the very first time a shadow was seen in anything other than the most basic humanoid monster form that had been used in this season up till this point. They had mostly showed up in the night before this, not broad daylight, walking down the side of the road. She was also burnt out and stressed. She had every reason to think this was a trick of her mind. For me, it ends up being frustrating more than anything else to see her beat herself up about this. However, I think that's a place where I just have to acknowledge that I am just of a different mindset than this character when it comes to this. It's much easier to say that as an outside observer, after all. However, that doesn't stop it from being something of a frustration point for me. And where it actually annoys me is more in how this swoops pretty close to something I wish the series grappled with more, but ultimately never does outside this episode. It can feel like the fact that these characters are now adults with adult responsibilities does not really factor into proceedings. At least, it doesn't very much. Now, we will get into this concept a little more with Saki, but that doesn't really relate to Precure stuff specifically and is more about different parts of her adult life intersecting instead. In regards to how Precure and their life interact, there is very little. There's not really any moment where they are forced to choose between an adult or work obligation and going to do Precure things. There's no point where they are forced to manage their priorities in that way. The closest we get is with Rin in the taxi, and even then, like I said before, there is some plausible deniability with that one that makes it feel like she really didn't have to make a big choice. This isn't a core series where the biggest consequence is if they don't make it to class, they might get in trouble or something like that. The choice about adult responsibilities can be more dire. If one of the girls chose not to show up for work for the sake of saving someone, she would have to weigh the work consequence of that up to and including possibly being fired. And yeah, maybe this is me not really meeting the series at its level that it's trying to be at, but at the same time, if you're going to have the selling point of your series for adult fans be that these characters are now adult, I think the fact that they are adults with different expectations and responsibilities than children, with different stakes than children, is something that should factor into the narrative of your series. Rin's moment of transformation is also a little muddled and can feel like it doesn't fully connect to the rest of her narrative that the episode has laid out for her. There is some connective tissue there, but I think it's not something that comes all the way together despite the way I think the writers wanted it to. Rin has a moment of self-doubt when she is with Karin at the tree. She admits that she doesn't know if she could become a Precure again, and doesn't feel like she could face Nozomi after she let the dog shadow go and prioritized the in-office design competition she was on her way to. And I hate to keep harping on this because it does really feel like it's just my personal hang-up, but I really think this would have been more of an impact if there was more of a choice being made here. Like if Rin saw a regular shadow, not some unknown one, and maybe saw it not attacking someone, but heading towards them instead of just walking down the side of the road all by itself. Something that maybe implied a real and present threat and then chose to go to work anyway. I think that would definitely make a more compelling reason for her to feel like she couldn't face Nozomi. However, at the same time, I completely understand the way that this might really downgrade Rin in the eyes of some viewers, make them dislike her, or even feel out of character for her in general. As much as I would love to have that level of drama and intrigue, I can also really understand not wanting to have a character make that kind of choice and risk completely changing how the audience ends up looking at them, especially if you are going to have them become a hero again in that same episode. So like I said in the recap, Rin has all her doubts and then ends up transforming so that she can be someone that Karin leans on for support. And this is because leaning on others and taking help from them is important because the two of them had a minute-long heart-to-heart that Karin thinks they might not have had as kids, but now they can because they are adults. And first off, given Precure and all, they definitely could have had this heart-to-heart about their problems when they were younger. But secondly, this feels kind of disconnected from the struggle that was weighing on Rin earlier in the episode. I get that seeing the dog shadow was meant to be a big moment, but it feels like that became her problem instead of the work stuff and suddenly became the focus episode and left all her work struggles as more of a lengthy prologue. While I love that Rin gets her groove back, it doesn't feel emotionally satisfying because it's the result of a conversation that only happened a moment before, and instead of her accepting that she can lean on others or something of that sort, it's about her wanting to be someone for others to lean on, feeling like it's only adding more to her plate rather than lifting some off of it. Compounding the issue is that the rest of her plot doesn't have much of a resolution this episode. After the fight, she gets to text everyone that she managed to transform into a Precure, and then the final scene of the episode is actually there to set up the fact that Urara is up next in the next episode. Nothing feels resolved, and after this, Rin kind of fades into the background again for the rest of the season, like most of the characters do after getting their focal moment. She gets one bit where she talks about working hard near the end, and that's about it, aside from a scene at the very end where she has managed to prep a pitch that her boss thinks will go over well, and then one still frame where she has a soccer ball with some children in what is clearly meant to be another country. Is that part of her jewelry pitch? Is it something to do with the making the world better like everyone was trying to do at the end of the series? Who knows? Either way, Rin ends up feeling unresolved. Like I just said, the end of Rin's episode teased that Urara was up next, and her episode is really the only place that she gets any attention over the course of the season, aside from being flavor in the background. Like, at least Karen got to be there and talk to Rin for her big moment, and Saki and Mai were supporting each other. Urara was off on her own most of the time and spends her focal episode with Syrup rather than any of the other Precure girls. Not that I'm entirely complaining about that, since this is really the only Syrup content that we're going to get, and the relationship between these two was one of the few things that I really enjoyed out of the Go-Go era of the show. Urara's main issues are that she is having trouble finding just the right way to approach her current role in a theatrical production, and that she has let her personal passions get put by the wayside so that she can focus on her career. I joked in my video on Yes 5 that Urara's biggest takeaway from that season was that she learned that she liked singing, but her picking that up ends up being used as a boon for her here. All focus early in the season was on Urara being an actor, and nothing about her having a singing career was ever really even brought up, until we saw Syrup again listening to her music while he's flying. He's always loved her singing, after all. At first, it felt a little odd, but then again, how her singing career was handled always felt a little strange to me though, so that's nothing new. The issue that Urara is having with work is that she is taking the instruction that the director gives her and working very hard with that, but it seems like she's not really putting all that much of herself and her own interpretations into things. She's at this crossroads where she's trying to have to figure out the balance between following the directions that she's given to execute the vision of the director and how much of her personal interpretation she can put into the character. A balance made all the harder by the way it seems she doesn't even know what that personal interpretation is herself, something the director notices, forcing her to take a few days off to figure it out. The girl has been real down on herself lately, and her confidence has taken a shot due to this job going poorly, so this really is all an episode about how Syrup helps her get her groove back by the two of them making some music together. Because her other issue is setting aside her enjoyment of music because that is too much of a distraction from her career. So I guess we can assume that her music career isn't something she pursued long term then, but it's unclear as to exactly how inactive of a thing it is. Overall, this is another case where I think the episode itself is decently solid and cohesive. The few complaints I have are little things, like the fact that Urara complains that she doesn't have a very famous aura, but at the same time also deliberately tries to disguise herself while going out. Like, sweetie, you can't have it both ways. Either you are trying to keep on the down low or not. Don't try and hide and then complain that nobody notices you. And also, the fact that she, a very thin girl, is dieting is dropped in a few lines, and then we don't really pay much attention to that aside from when she does allow herself to indulge in a treat. It feels like they wanted to comment on the image standards that her industry would be putting her through, but also didn't want to commit to tackling such a big issue. So this ends up as a symbol for how she has been personally repressing herself instead of pointing out that there are impossible standards that are expected of her due to her choice in career. In an ideal world where this season was longer, I would have loved to see her grapple more with the idea of personal variation in acting versus what the director wants out of you. Maybe she and the director disagree on some key point and she has to weigh sticking with her guns against the vision of the person in charge of the overall piece. In the end, her whole arc in the show is really about how she needs to take a breather and lighten up, which I think is plenty fine. I guess I can't get mad at her for not getting a ton when I never felt like she got much before now. This really ended up feeling like the most she ever got to stand out to me. It's just another one of those things, though, where I feel like just one episode really wasn't enough to get into this. There is a little sprinkling in the lead up to her episode where we'll get a scene every once in a while that basically shows us things aren't going great for her. But in a season with more breathing room where we weren't segmenting everything into cleanly cut episodes like this, I think that her storyline could have perhaps come together a little more strongly. I know that she is working through things over a decent period of time because of the way that her episode montages, but because her resolution was mostly all crammed into one episode, it doesn't feel like she was working through this for a length of time, more like an afternoon. I said what I said. They really did Komachi dirty this season. Most of that comes down to the way that her episode is positioned in the season. By the time that it is her turn to have an episode, we're deep enough into the season that the main plot has to come to the forefront more. Thus, a decent amount of the runtime of her episode gets eaten up by her going on an exposition trip to see Honoka's grandma. And there were ways that this could have tied into what she is going through, but I think the choices that the writers made kept them from doing something compelling with her. Komachi is very obviously suffering from a writing rut for a good portion of the season, and it seems that her writing career hasn't exactly panned out in the way she was hoping it would. She got published, sure, but at the same time she says she feels she can't call herself a novelist just yet, and when a kid asked her if her book is in the school library, Komachi says that she doesn't think so. All this seems to point to the idea that despite the accomplishment of being published, her novel either didn't sell well or reviewed poorly or something of that nature that shook her confidence in it. It would not be the first time that she got her confidence in her work shaken like that after all. Add to that, she still lives in her family home, isn't sure what she should write next, and is basically filling her time by becoming a valuable, upstanding support pillar of the neighborhood. I doubt that is really what she thought that her life as a writer would look like. It seems like she's also primed for one of those episodes about how she gets her groove back and finds inspiration like Urara, but that doesn't happen. Instead, there is a lot of talking and exposition about the town, and this somewhat connects since Komachi has really woven herself into the local community of the town these days. Yet at the same time, there is this sort of vibe and implication that as much as she loves the area, there is part of her that is doing this as a way to fill her time because she's not really working on any personal or professional projects at the moment. The most she's done lately is an essay in the local paper, after all. And so when she does transform, it's because she sees the garden that she's worked in so much all torn up, and it makes her want to really protect the town that she's become a part of. And it doesn't really feel like that triumphant of a moment. Like, I love her finding purpose and meaning in what she has been doing, seeing how much it connects everyone together and all that. That's good stuff. But at the same time, it does feel like we're ignoring that she seems to have gotten so ingrained in the community because she's not working all that much on her personal dreams. From this point on, we mostly just see outstanding pillar of the community Komachi, not writer Komachi. In fact, her epilogue still image at the end of the season is her doing a local environmental event. There's a blink and you miss it mention of her doing some new writing, but it's not something that feels like it came out of the experiences of the time that we're focusing on her in the show. And I think there is a really simple way that you could have tied both sides of what Komachi is doing in the show together. Make her change her writing focus. Instead of having her be like, I'm part of the town, and leave it at that with just a little lip service paid how she might be writing again, have her instead decide that she wants to do some nonfiction work. Have her collect stories like the ones from Honoka's grandma. Have her write the story of the town that she has become so connected to. Have this work that she has done in the community serve as her inspiration point to do something with. It would have brought everything together rather than just ignoring the fact that she's got this writer's block. And hey, maybe this was meant to be the interpretation of what she's doing or the intent behind what they were going for. But if it was, that's not clear, and it makes Komachi feel like an afterthought in what is meant to be her specified episode. Once again, a victim of the 12-episode season order. So, you remember back when I was talking about Rin, and I mentioned that I would have liked adult responsibilities to play a little more into how things were going in the show? Well, Saki is the one place I think delivered on that as a concept. Her whole deal is that she's got adult responsibilities that she believes are going to get in the way of her doing things she wants to do. And the show tries to represent that to us decently well. Saki literally gets a text from her fiancé about looking at wedding locations while she is in the middle of looking at a bread-making course in France that she very evidently wants to try. Every time she starts really considering it, there is something that pulls her back down to earth again. And it all works better than the way this was done for Rin, except for two key problems with how it's done in the show. Firstly is the handling of the big moment that is meant to be the climax of the episode. Funnily enough, it also happens at the Sky Tree, just like it did with Rin, but this time it's with both of the Splash Shot Girls. Before the both of them get attacked, they've been having this conversation about how Saki feels bound by her adult responsibilities, keeping her from pursuing a dream. She's not able to just pack up and run away and do something like she might have been able to when she was younger. So when the attack does happen, Mai is ready and willing to turn into a Precure, and Saki says she can't because she's not the person she was back then. Mai saying that she is enough to change her mind. This is another moment where I can kind of maybe see what the idea was, but it just isn't connecting right with the larger personal struggle that she's going through in the way that I think it was meant to. Saki's issue was feeling the constraint of her responsibilities, not that she was a different person than she used to be. It was an internal conflict about her desire to pursue something clashing against the expectations that she believes surround her, not some internal struggle about her sense of self. And maybe there was supposed to be some kind of element there about her tying her desires and sense of self together, but if that was the intention, it was just really didn't come across that way. It also runs up against the issue of what is happening to them in that moment is a very real thing. They are being attacked by a monster, full stop. This isn't her saying, I'm not a kid anymore, to Mai trying to pull her into some fantasy or moment of imagination. There is a monster right there that she can see, and turning into a Precure again is just about the only way that they are going to be able to protect themselves. I can understand that the idea is maybe she isn't sure she can turn into a Precure again because she's not the same as she once was, and maybe only the old version of herself could do that. I think this would be an interesting concept for an aged-up magical girl to have to confront, but that's not really the story that was being told with Saki up to that point in the episode, and if they were going to have that be what they wanted to go with, it would have done them well to have Saki be more of a different person than she used to be. To us as viewers, she very much seems to be the same character, so if they were trying to portray her as being reasonably different from how she was as a kid, I think that they could have done that better outside of her just having some more considerations in her life, as while there might be a lot of her that's changed through growing up, that's not really evident to those of us who are only seeing a few moments out of her life compared to everything about her. It ends up feeling like there were two concepts here for what would be Saki's conflict, but neither were completely fleshed out to support her whole episode, and both got shoved in there, making something that is really just a mess in general. It's one of those cases where I can get a glimpse of what they were maybe going for when putting this together, but it feels like an early draft that never got all the kinks worked out of it. The other issue that Saki's plot suffers from is a completely anticlimactic ending and lack of buildup. When we see Saki in the start of the series, it's made clear that she is pretty damn proud of that food truck she's selling bread out of, even trying to take it to out-of-the-way places like some near-empty apartment block to try and sell to the people there that might want some. Every time we see her, she seems extremely happy and contented with her life. And yes, you can obviously say that this is a mask for her real feelings, which people do in their real lives all the time. She's not obligated to tell everyone in the world her baggage after all. However, this is a narrative story that has been constructed by someone, not real life. Something that benefits from setup and payoff or from foreshadowing. It can only be a help to the audience to have us wondering what's going on with Saki, to get a glimpse into her troubles before they actually come to the forefront. I don't need a whole scene of her being sad or anything, but just even a little hint that she's unsure about her future might be nice. Otherwise, it ends up feeling like this issue is coming completely out of left field, just as a reason to give her a focal episode, which is how things ended up. Saki has always had a really supportive family from what we can see, but even if that's the case, I can understand why she would have her reservations about telling him about this program that she wants to do. I mean, if I decided to quit my day job in a blaze of glory and go full-time on making videos like this when I'm not even a place where it could come close to covering my bills, no matter how supportive my mom is, I don't think that's something she would just agree with me on, no question. There would be questions of logistics and such. She would probably be worried about my mental health, since that would be fairly out of character for me. Saki's concerns come from the fact that she is in the middle of planning her wedding and has responsibilities related to the work she does for her parents. She's already completed her education, so she doesn't really need to do a program like this. It might benefit her in many ways, sure, and ongoing education can be important in many fields, But it's worth considering that this is a program about halfway around the world as well. There can be both risks and benefits to weigh. Is there maybe something closer to home that could give a similar experience? What's the cost? How much will this set back plans she's already laid in motion with her fiancé? However, none of that is really taken into consideration. And I never really expected that the show was going to get into all the details about how this would affect her and those around her, and how she'd have to come to that decision with her family. However, it does feel like a narrative letdown when both her parents and her faceless fiancé both just immediately go, "Yep, you have our support to put everything on hold to go live this dream program. Have fun." The show even lampshades this by having the characters comment about the anticlimax, but just because you are aware of it as a writer and let us know that doesn't make this lackluster resolution any less disappointing. But hey, like I said, Saki's fiancé is some faceless guy. Of course he was going to completely support her with no questions. He's not even an actual character. Well, if there's one thing I can happily say that this does better as a crossover event for Precure than any of the movies I've seen so far, is that they actually allow Michiru and Kaoru to be characters and get some recognition for their place in the series. These two were one of the better parts of their season, for good reason, but despite taking part in the final battle of that season, they were never really given the chance to be anything more than a background cameo, at least as far as the movies I've seen so far, though I doubt that this is something that's going to end up changing all that much. So, giving them a chance to have some spotlight as supporting characters in this season, even if they're not going to get their own focal episodes, that's something I can live with. The rollout of these two over the course of the season is a little bit of a slow burn. The first time we see them come up, it actually feels like something more of an Easter egg. Considering some of the other little details about characters that the first episode was feeding us, this was something that you could have, at the time, just taken as a background detail, telling us where the two characters were all these years later. The designs of their online avatars being so obvious was clearly more for the sake of the audience, since none of the girls recognized them based off those designs or their voices. Which made it a little bit of a delightful surprise when they ended up actually being an element of the plot. Granted, they weren't all that interesting of a plot element, but they were indeed one. Through the way that their streams and videos documented rumors and sightings of the shadows that served as the monsters of the season, they were a plot device that allowed writers to drip feed information to the characters without them having to be in the right place at the right time to either see something themselves or overhear people swapping rumors. Which, it's a narrative shortcut, sure, but it's one I can understand using. It adds some flavor to the world, gets some use out of old characters, and cuts down on our characters conveniently being in the right place at the right time over and over and over again. Heck, it even provides a little entertainment by having Michiru and Kaoru be downright weird in the videos, giving us slight moments of comedy while this information is delivered to us. And with how they grew more and more relevant in the plot, it was only a matter of time before they showed up, which is where I started having problems with them. So, here's the thing. One of the parts that made them so endearing over the course of Splash Star is seeing the way that they come to love the world and become more human over time as they connect with the people around them. The moment that they first crack a smile is a big deal in that series, for example. It's one of those things where you hope they would have been able to continue to grow, change, and discover after that season had ended. That they would have remained friends with Saki and Mai since they were so instrumental in allowing them to discover the world. However, that's not the case here. It feels like these two were picked right out of the end of Splash Star, aged up, and then dropped right into the start of Otona with no consideration for the way that two characters that were in such flux and growth would have perhaps changed in the years between. The fact that they run a YouTube channel dedicated to finding fun and beautiful things in order to share them with others, that completely tracks, and feels like something that would have been born from the experience they went through. Having the world shown to them literally changed the course of their lives forever, and quite possibly set in motion the events that saved them from dying at the end of the series. However, the way they sometimes talk to people feels off. While they came to love the world in Splash Star, they seem kind of judgmental by the time they're showing up in the flesh in Otona. And if it were a case that they had recently had experiences that made them doubt in people, this would make sense to me. But because their involvement with things doesn't feel entirely fleshed out, they end up coming off as if they're still trying to figure out if they like humanity or not. Despite how, by this point, they would have been living among humans for like a decade, it feels like they weren't fully thought through, or that they were regressed for the sake of keeping them familiar to fans. It causes there to be this weirdly ungenerous view of humanity as a whole. One of the things that stands out most to me is when the two of them are talking with the mascots, and in the course of that conversation, there's mention that a lot of humans are bad, but some of them are good, so humanity is worth protecting. I don't know if this was possibly a translation issue, but it really gives off this vibe of, well, yeah, most humans suck, but there's a handful that are fine, so I guess we should protect them for the sake of that handful. Which, like, wow, thanks guys, good to see what you really think of people. While I was glad to see them get some attention, I think it might have been at the cost of the series a little. Their entire involvement in the ending episodes of the series causes this yo-yoing effect that drags out the final battle for longer than it needed to be. Lived among humans for all this time and didn't consider that maybe showing a monster to people who can't do anything about it might cause them to experience some apathy or despair. You know, the thing that Belle and the monster kind of thrive on. Didn't really think that one through, did ya? Did this really need to be its own point? No, not really. But it irritated me enough that I felt like I had to make it one so I could have a mini rant on it, because the mini rant wasn't going to fit anywhere else in this video. Let's talk about the little plot detail about the developers that want to get rid of the big magic tree from Splash Star for the sake of putting up more buildings in progress. Now, if they were going to do this, doing it with the Sky Tree makes sense. It was one of the big icons of Splash Star, so people who like that season are liable to care about it. Not to mention that season was pretty nature-themed compared to the more city-based stories of the S5 crew, so yeah, good choice and something to aim the ambitious land developers at, I'll give you that. Here's the thing. We are aware of these plans as the audience, but the main characters don't seem to have much of an idea that it's going on, if any. I can't recall any of them having a conversation about it, and if it was something they acknowledged, it was either through a glance at the developers while passing them, or a quick throwaway line at the most. And that wouldn't be a problem if the way they resolved the plot line wasn't so horrible. So we see the developers all of twice, purely as a way to get some shadows to get made all the way out in the woods like that. Then we later get a short conversation where it is mentioned between the girls that the development has been canceled due to local protests. And if that is what led to things being canceled, that's perfectly fine. But at the same time, it is yet another stunning anticlimax that feels like it either needed a lot of expansion or to be removed altogether. I get the impression that this short conversation was thrown in mostly to reassure the viewers that we would not be losing this icon of Splash Star so easily. A little moment to make sure that the idea of the tree being torn down wasn't an open-ended question at the end of the season. In execution, though, it ends up feeling like an anticlimax to a plotline that we never got anything more than a glimpse of. Once again, I think this is for lack of time. There's no room for them to have a plotline about the girls worrying about this or make any change themselves. And I think that hurts things more than the writers may have realized. You see, in the end, this series tries to conclude with the overall message that we can't just wait around for other people to save us, but that we have to put forth an effort to make change ourselves in connection with the themes of environmentalism that the series is going for with Belle's whole problem with everyone. However, if you look at how this plot line about saving this forested area is handled, the Precure girls don't lift a finger to do anything about it. All the effort is handled by people other than them that we never even see on screen. We get a shot later in the final episode that shows Komachi and Mai at an environmental event handing out flyers of some sort, but they were never involved in the supposed protest about this tree as far as we can tell. So despite the overall message that the series is attempting being that we need to put in effort ourselves, apparently that doesn't apply to Precure girls. They can let someone else handle things for them. And if they can let someone else handle things for them, well, I guess I can too, right? And I get that the show doesn't really have time for this whole plot line in the first place, and since it doesn't feel like it would tie much into any of the personal plots of the girls, it would be hard to slip this into one of their individual episodes. Maybe you could swing it with Komachi, but her community connection is more about her neighborhood, and she doesn't have any personal investment in the Splash Star town, which is still a different place, just closer than we initially thought it to be. If there can't be any more episodes gotten, then the best way to handle this would have been to cut the plotline entirely. You don't lose all that much in the series by removing it, and keeping it in only serves to show both a weakness in the writing of the season and somewhat undermine the main theme that you were going for with the overall plot and villain. Okay, now for something that is a bit of a bigger problem in the writing. These damn time flowers that keep popping up. First thing about them is an issue with the number of times I ended up writing in my notes that the show clarified to us that they were supposedly sinister. We are told this over and over and over again, only for the series to ultimately conclude that the flower itself was not actually the cause of any problems, but was instead a warning omen, like Mothman or the Pokemon Absol. And that is a perfectly fine conclusion to come to, but if that's going to be the case, it feels like the flower needs to have some more purpose than to point at it and go, ooh, spooky. Oh, and if it was going to be the case that it didn't actually do anything and it was just a warning, then the way the show presented it was way off. From the moment that the time flower appears, they are very clearly linked with the girls themselves. Every time one of them manages to transform, another one of the flowers blooms, and while I don't believe it is outright said, it leads to this very heavily implication that the flowers are the reason that everyone's able to transform again. If the fact that this is a time flower and the fact that they de-age in order to transform didn't already give them some semblance of a connection. It's clear that the two are meant to be linked somehow, and it's the justification for why they're able to transform again, even if it's been years since they were last able to. Nozomi starts having her health issues and dizzy spells when one of the flowers starts losing its petals, and when it fully wilts is when she goes comatose. I don't think it's a stretch to say that the connection with the flower is what caused her to get sick and collapse. As the flower died, so did she. It's very clear in the visual language as the show. So much so that they show the flower wilting as Nozomi collapses for the last time. It's not at all subtle, and there's no other cause that could be found at the hospitals as to why an otherwise perfectly healthy young woman would be in a coma. But then it's all walked back somewhat in one of the final scenes of the series, with Nuts straight up saying that the flower is called sinister, but maybe it's actually a warning and that's the end of it. And perhaps the idea is that it's meant to be both, but the show ends up being really unclear with what the deal with these flowers is. It even has one drop of fruit so another can sprout, so it seems like we're going to be right back in the same place again as soon as that one grows a little bit, yeah? So, is the idea to have it be like the doomsday clock that's maintained by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists? This sign that we're always just a step away from the worst future? I think that's what the idea is meant to be, but it's really hard to tell when we spent all season with it being called sinister and then gave a very clear visual tie to one of the characters almost dying. It's just this weird extra plot point that didn't need to be there. Their powers always came from some nebulous magical force before, so I don't think there was really a need to have some reason explaining why they were back now. Just having the butterflies appear to them again would have been enough for the main girls, and then we could assume there was something in the water when it happened to Saki and Mai again. If you really want to still have that element of Nozomi being unwell, then maybe have some throwaway dialogue about how this is more of a strain on their bodies now for some reason. Perhaps that this is all happening in a shorter time span and they're transforming more often than they used to while they were younger. It's yet another one of those places where I can see what the idea of what they were going for was, but the execution didn't come together in the way I think it was meant to the point where I would rather the plot element be cut than linger in the story in the messy form that it's in. Okay, it's finally time to talk about the big one, Belle. And this isn't going to just talk about her character. We'll certainly do that, but we're also going to be looking at the very way the series was structured when it comes to her plotline and how I think the whole thing just turned into an overall mess by the end. Seems like that's becoming a running theme, doesn't it? To start with, Belle is a hypocrite. It's just how she comes off when you try to look at everything about her and try to lay out her viewpoints. And to be clear, that is not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes, when carefully done, having a character whose views don't quite make sense can make them more compelling. Does their hypocrisy come from them genuinely not understanding some of the potential consequences of their views, showing the way that they have tunnel visioned on one aspect while leaving others to the side? Does it come from them perhaps just using these views as a cover for another motivation, giving away that they don't actually care as much as they claim to? Or do they perhaps know that there are consequences, but it turns out that they don't care as long as a specified aspect of their worldview is fulfilled? Having a character who's a hypocrite is not a bad thing, but it needs to be for some kind of a reason. And really, Belle doesn't have a reason to be one. She's one of the variety I've mentioned before, one that is so tunnel visioned on the outcome and what her perceived source of the problem is that she can't see the unintended consequences or consider new problems her approach might create. And that would be fine. In fact, it has the potential to make her very compelling if handled carefully. The problem is, though, that Belle ends up being more frustrating to watch than I think the intriguing touch the writers were hoping for. The problem is that Belle is unwilling or unable to engage in any discussion without resorting back to the core idea or two that she's running off of. Even when new information or counter-arguments are presented to her, she will simply default back to, no, it's your fault, humans suck. And if that only happened once or twice, that would be one thing. But Belle spends most of her screen time saying different variations of humans are the problem over and over. It gets old very quickly and can feel like the show thinks I will forget her motivation if she's not saying it every time she's on screen. If she were meant to be some sort of force of nature that wasn't able to think more than beyond a simple thought, that would be one thing. But Belle is clearly meant to be somewhat complex and is completely there to drive home the environmental message that the show is going for. To be clear, I don't think that the environmental message itself is a problem at all. In fact, I agree with it that everyone needs to be doing a little more for the world around them. However, I think the presentation here is very on the nose. Like, this is about as on the nose as an episode of Captain Planet, and presents very simple concepts of conservation in a way that it feels like it's talking to someone who has never heard of them before. I didn't mention it in the recap, but it shows up very blatantly in the first episode with Nozomi teaching her students about it. Even Tokyo Mew Mew, a literal magical girl series about conservation and endangered animals, has more subtlety than this. This is a show for adults who have likely been getting this sort of messaging taught to them for a long time. I understand that there might have been some effort to make the series approachable to kids on some level because it is still Precure, but this is so heavy-handed that I could sometimes feel like I was being talked down to. It was a presentation of the messaging that had me going, yeah, I get it, more than once. I think part of this is the result of each character getting these focal episodes. Because we are centering multiple episodes, most of the season in fact, around the character stories, the main plot has to be something that is simple enough to shove into the margins of that. It has to be something that can be understood without getting too much focus, but because it is so straightforward, it means that when we do end up focusing completely in on Belle and her beliefs at the end of the series, they feel underbaked, causing things to end up feeling repetitive when Belle only has a few points to keep falling back on. This is especially bad in the final few episodes when the girls confront Belle head on. There are points where everyone kind of feels like they are talking in circles when they're trying to settle Belle down, which is understandable. But at a certain point, it feels like it's being done to pad time without having to animate a big fight, you know? The whole handling things is also a little confusing and unclear when Belle talks about how the town was destroyed. At first, it's laid out that basically the problems of climate change, such as droughts, plant die-off, and stronger storms, caused people to leave the town en masse until there was nobody left and she was left guarding a bunch of empty buildings. However, there are also points where we are shown the town in its abandoned state and it straight up looks like it got bombed out from the way the buildings look, and we're also shown the place being on fire. So, was that caused by the bad storms, or was there more of a disaster than the people just leaving? The mixed visual signals aren't helping with what we're being told. It also doesn't help that the people Belle is targeting are also something of a mixed bag. Okay, so the girl who orders cute food just to post a picture and then doesn't eat it because she doesn't want to get fat. That makes sense as someone for her to target. People littering. Yeah, that tracks. But there's some odd ones out there that feel like they're thrown in, once again, to pad things out. There's a shot of a guy who seems to be just standing next to a running delivery truck. Like, yeah, don't leave your car running for no reason. But with no context, it ends up looking like he was attacked out of nowhere. We're not given a reasoning or motivation for him like with the Parfait girls. So even watching it back and rethinking, I can see the logic for what they might have been going for, but the first time you see it in the moment, it's a little hard to divine. Belle states herself at one point she is getting rid of all the weak-willed and selfish people. And those are two things that, in the context of what her motivation and goals are, don't really completely make sense. The selfish part, yeah, that tracks. She's upset that people are thinking about their own short-term enjoyment rather than the long-term health of the town, so it completely works that she would view everything going into that as selfishness. The weak-willed part is where things start getting nebulous. Are they weak-willed because they don't have a personal conviction? Are they weak-willed because they aren't following her ideas? Are they weak-willed for being apathetic and allowing life to carry them along? It's hard to say what exactly she means by this and what removing that set of people will do to further cause. The supposedly selfish people being removed have a through line as to how that helps her goals, but the part about weak-willed people being removed as well is where we run into an issue. There's also a point that is meant to be an example of the problem where the shadows speak to show the apathetic attitudes of humans, and one of them says, "It's a waste to throw it away, but it's expired." And once again, yes, don't buy more food than you need to and let it go to waste, obviously. However, if you're at that point, yeah, you should throw it away. I don't think this was the impression that the writers meant to give by having that line there, but the first thought it gave me was questioning if Belle wanted people to risk getting sick just to make sure expired food was eaten. I don't think this was the intent behind that, but I can't be the only one that ended up thinking that way, which just leads to frustration with this character who is so hardline and won't be reasoned with in the slightest. Belle is ultimately a frustrating character, mostly because that hardline stance she takes. Whatever she thinks is right, and everyone who is not her is wrong, even when they try and put up a reasonable argument. The girls are right when they point out that if all the people in the town are gone because Belle took their shadows, it's not really the town anymore. The people make up the town, and removing them just to save the town puts her back in the same place of presiding over an empty town that is slowly rotting away. However, Belle refuses to take in any information at all. She only changes her attitude slightly when the kaiju she created seems to start acting out of her control and begins destroying buildings in the process. That's the point where it starts to feel like she doesn't care about the town and just the buildings and structures themselves. This upsets her and seems to throw her off kilter for the first time. And even then, she still decides that this is ultimately somehow the fault of humans, even though it is legitimately 100% on her. Like I said, it is possible to do a hypocrite character well. It's even possible to do a character that is incapable of changing their beliefs well, but the way it was handled in Otona just makes for a frustrating watching experience. And that might not be the case for some people, and even if you weren't as frustrated with Belle as I was, I doubt that there are many who would count her among the most interesting Precure villains or even the more memorable. Belle's motivation also has one other lingering question that doesn't ever feel like it gets answered. Why now? Belle is very clearly laid out to be from the future and traveling back in time to the same Belle that she has resided in to take up this task of preventing the future that she does not want. So it begs the question, why at this point? Why is this the spot in the timeline she chose to do this? It's unclear. And sure, maybe there doesn't need to be an exact reason, but Belle acts like the world is about to end very soon if she doesn't accomplish her goals now. So it would have been nice if whatever ticking clock she had in mind was more clear to us. The obvious answer is because climate change is something that people are concerned about now, and she exists now to give a reason for Otona to happen. But that's a case of the explanation lying with the writers rather than with the character. There's also issues with the way her plot is paced out in the series. It's something that ramps up over time, and it makes sense that it's not extremely present in the first few episodes. However, information isn't paced out as well as it could have been. Instead of a slow drip feed of information over the course of the season that keeps getting us steadily closer to the truth, we instead end up with scenes that exist purely for exposition jumping. The longer the season goes on, the more this cuts into the runtime, which is made all the worse when the characters end up going in circles nearly as much as Belle's rhetoric. This happens when they learn about Belle's bell in Komachi's episode, and it absolutely drove me up the wall. So they go and they head up to the bell tower to take a look at the bell itself. In the moment, they find the angelic design on the bell and are like, yeah, that looks like the bell we're dealing with, but there's not really anything else here about this decoration, so maybe she's not here herself. They basically conclude that they didn't find anything, but then, right before Nozomi collapses for the first time, they're all gearing up to go and look at the bell tower again like they haven't done that. Look, I get the idea of a double check, but this feels less like them going because they have more information or insight, and more like them going because the plot is spinning its wheels and they don't have any other leads. But then the series just... Okay, so they're going off for this double check, but since Nozomi collapses, they obviously take her to the hospital to get checked out. Once that's over and everyone is taking in the news about her condition on their own time, it's stated that they know Belle is at the clock tower. Fucking what? You were leaving for your second check when Nozomi collapsed and never made it there, but now you're completely certain Belle is at the clock tower? Did they go check before taking Nozomi to the hospital and just leave her lying on the sidewalk until they were done? Did they take the collapse as a sign that they were right about where she was? It's technically possible that they went and looked after they got Nozomi checked out, but the flow of the scenes go right from the hospital to everyone processing the news. If it was meant to be something in between, we don't see it, and knowing for sure that Belle is at the clock tower feels like a pretty pivotal scene that it would be a big mistake to just skip over. To me, at least, it seems like something slipped through the cracks between the various drafts of the show, and the timeline about how much they know about Belle and the clock tower connection just got muddled and mixed up in the process. Look, I get it. Making a show is hard, especially when you have as many cooks in the kitchen as I am sure happens over at Toei. However, when you have only 12 episodes, little details like this are all the more important because the fewer episodes you have, the more obvious it becomes when you slip up. It's frustration on top of frustration because plot details aren't being doled out at a pace that feels good, and part of that is because there's not a lot of plot details to dole out. Once we have the backstory on Belle and her motivations, there's not any more plot to learn. Things just get reiterated to us over and over again. I am caught in this place of wondering if they kept it simple on purpose because they were only getting 12 episodes, but ended up going too simple, which leads to these issues of repetition. I understand that sometimes the audience can need a reminder of things, but if I was feeling repeated to when watching this show week to week, I can only imagine how that will end up feeling on a binge watch. And what's the worst thing about this? It's that after having the whole plot wrap up with there being some hope for the future and everyone moving forward to make everything better now that Belle is settled down and they really have a chance to focus on other problems in the world, the show chooses to end on a really cynical note. The moment at the end of the season where someone tosses a can and it gets zapped with Belle's powers just feels like, despite everything that they have very heavy-handedly shown us, the show does not expect that anyone will actually be able to make a change and people will continue on just as they have been doing, which is just really sad. It really didn't need to be that. It feels out of step with an otherwise really hopeful ending. Okay, let's do this. If anyone actually thought the series was going to put an end to this ship and break Coco and Nozomi up, I'm sorry, but you're a little delusional. Cocozomi is something that, as far as I can tell, has always been pretty popular in Japan, and it's pretty obvious that Toei isn't all that interested in listening to the English-speaking fan base for these sorts of big choices. I know some people might not like that, but it is what it is. For a refresher on my personal position on this, I am not someone who is generally upset by the existence of Cocozomi in the wider experience of the Yes 5 characters. I understand why some people might not like it, but I also think that some of the reactions to the whole deal are a little overblown. If you want my detailed thoughts, you can take a look at my video on Yes 5 for more in-depth information. The long and the short of it for me, though, is that they're fine, there's chemistry, and they work well enough, but I'm not enamored with the whole thing, and I'm not going to be seeking out the fanfictions. Personally, I was glad that the series held back a little at the start instead of shoving this couple in our faces right away. It gave the characters a little time to breathe and let us get to know Nozomi again outside the context of her relationship. However, it is also a bit of a problem since it allows us to hear about the thing that I knew was going to be so contentious the moment I saw it. The whole thing where Coco was secretly visiting Nozomi and watching over her despite the fact that they weren't otherwise seeing each other. The second I saw that, I knew there was going to be a certain subsection of people that were going to take that in the least charitable way possible. And I was right. It didn't take long at all for me to find someone who was calling a Coco a creepy stalker. Here's the thing. Fiction is not reality. I know. Sometimes people use that argument to defend some pretty vile stuff in media. There can be arguments made about how fiction can sometimes lead to impressions about reality, but that does not change the fact that fiction is an inherently safer way to explore concepts and scenarios that we would not want to genuinely experience in real life. For example, there are plenty of people who like things like dark romance and monster romance, despite the fact that if you actually live through the events of that mafia boss romance story, you likely wouldn't find it nearly as enjoyable as the book version. This is one of the reasons why, even if I don't like something, I'm not going to tell someone that they can't put it in their story. I have the ultimate out of simply choosing not to engage with that media. There can be discussions had of the handling of sensitive or problematic tropes, of course, but fiction is a layer removed from reality, and we have to take that into account when we are engaging with it. Coco's behavior is not healthy. It's not good for him or his relationship, and it's not something I would condone someone doing with their long-distance partner. However, when I take it in the context of fiction, I see it for what it is, the utilization of what is meant to be a romantic trope. These days, you're liable to hear people bring up tropes as a way to score points against media, like they're the plot holding in some kind of list of sins. However, what tropes really are building blocks that we can use to construct stories. There isn't a story out there that doesn't contain some kind of a trope, however minor they may be. People might not always like tropes, but they became a trope for a reason. On some level, they work as either an effective storytelling method or as shorthand to get the audience up to speed relatively quickly. For example, Heartcatch Precure has Yuri's backstory contains a trope of a dead partner or companion. Hearing that tells you a lot in an instant about what she has been through, while also being a very quick and effective way to establish not only stakes, but backstory and motivation for many of the actions she takes in the present. Tropes are not inherently bad things, but they can be poorly executed. Basically, a trope is a building block, but you want people to pay more attention to the castle you built out of them than the blocks you made the castle from. If you put your blocks together poorly, use the wrong type, or make the blocks call attention to themselves, that's where you run into problems. Everyone uses blocks, but not everyone uses them as effectively as others. So what does all that have to do with Coco's behavior? Well, he's using some pretty well-worn romance tropes that are meant to be a signal to us that even if he is being aloof or distant with Nozomi, he still loves her. It's a signal to us as the audience to show that he still cares when the character on the other end of the relationship is questioning that. Coco is well aware that he is, in reality, a fluffy mascot fairy thing. He is also aware that he is the king of a magical kingdom separated from the human world. He is aware that Nozomi is human and has a job in the human world that she both has worked really hard for and truly loves to do. It's obvious that his distancing himself from her is completely intentional because he believes they cannot be together because of these factors. He states this directly in the show. He is acting under the expectation that to have Nozomi is to deprive her of her dream, and to let her have her dream means letting her go. So he makes the move to wind down the relationship and bring it to an end so he can let her keep her dream and not interfere. But he still loves her, he wants to see her, needs to do so as an assurance that she is really okay beyond the letters that she sends him. So he goes to the human world to see her, watching from a distance. While in reality, this would be strange and unhealthy behavior, when looking at the context of a fictional romance, this is clearly a use of a romantic trope. Loving someone and trying to let go of them for their happiness, but being unable to completely let go because of your own feelings. I don't think it's a problem to play with these sort of tropes, and I think they are something that can be genuinely sweet if done well. But there's the problem that there are people who already don't like Coco, and for them, this just comes across in the worst way possible, no matter how carefully done the execution is. And to be clear, the execution of this was not carefully done. In fact, it's done pretty sloppily, wobbling back and forth on if the lack of context since Nozomi's graduation was her idea, an agreement, or something Coco suggested. It's unclear, leading to further lack of clarity when they try and sort through the feelings of these characters. Nozomi was all peaches and cream cheery about the state of things, but the second Coco doesn't come while Nuts does, she is suddenly very shaken in her relationship. It's a sort of whiplash that comes from there not really being a very cohesive vision and idea for the progression of things. It's like they had the starting point planned and the end goal, but all the rest in the middle, it's whatever. It doesn't matter how we get to the wedding, just that we get there to make the shippers happy. The biggest problem with Cocozomi in this series is, much like other aspects, there's just not enough time to flesh it out, and as a result, the whole thing feels underbaked and unsatisfying. If this is the climax of the romance, then it should feel more, well, climactic. But once again, as the result of there being only 12 episodes, we don't have much time to pay attention to them without it being to the detriment of other aspects of the series. A detriment that those other aspects might not have been able to take. I think this could have been made to function better if the series had just 6 more episodes, or even better, a whole extra set of 12. For example, we have the plot point in the season that Coco moved in next door to Nozomi, but we never get to actually see the dynamic of that because we only have the one scene where he moved in, so we could do that for the sake of a gag. Give me an episode where Coco tries to make up for lost time by taking Nozomi out on a date. Have the dynamic between them be something that's a little strained now because they haven't seen each other all that much. Maybe they try to go back to the way things were, but it just doesn't work. Time marches forward and waits for no one. You know, time, one of the concepts of the series that could have used a little more fleshing out. There is no turning back time and there's no halting it. Things move forward, things change. Relationships change and grow and evolve. And because of their time apart, that hasn't happened the same for these two. They've been apart. They've grown in different ways and at different paces. They're different than they were before, but that's not a bad thing. Okay, now I'm just coming up with what I want from this and not meeting it at its level, but I'm trying to make clear how this could have functioned, how this could have been saved, and even with some tweaking in other places, how their relationship could have been made to tie into the core theme that the series could have been centered on. What is there now is half-baked, and honestly a little melodramatic, which is certainly a change since these two usually were pretty plain milquetoast fluff most of the time. Coco, is it really that big of an obstacle for you two to be from different worlds when it seems like it's not any trouble for you or other characters to pop back and forth between them these days? Perhaps it might have been better to focus on more adult aspects of their relationship for the show aimed at adults. Maybe marrying a human could have political consequences for Coco, play into the fact that he's a king more rather than this being about wanting to let Nozomi have her dream. The stakes could be higher for him. Consider the fact that these two likely would not be able to have children together. Is Nozomi okay with not having kids or growing her family through adoption? If so, would they adopt humans or fairies? Sure, these would be a bit much to get into in a magical girl show, but when the biggest issue Nozomi is wondering is, does he still like me? Like a middle schooler, my mind can't help but wander to wider possibilities, even if I logically know that these are not topics that the series is going to address. That's another one of the problems with this thing. The relationship doesn't feel mature, and I don't mean mature in the sense of anything sexual, but in the sense that Nozomi and Coco's relationship troubles feel like they're still something out of base Precure. It doesn't feel like they are approaching the relationship like adults. It might not be the intention the writers were going for, but it made me feel like Nozomi's relationship was in a sort of state of arrested development. After all, the guy she's dating is not a human and doesn't even live in the same world as she does. How much of a regular dating experience did she get? Did they even date at all? It's unclear since we're mostly told that Coco visited, not that they went on dates or anything. And yeah, maybe it's implied that they did, but at the same time, their behavior leaves me wondering. When they talk in the hospital at the very end of the series, the discussion feels more like a confession than working out their relationship troubles. A confession that feels like it should have happened years ago at this point if they were so readily calling Coco Nozomi's soulmate. The vibe of the interaction feels like this is the first bloom of a relationship, not a conversation that's going to lead to a proposal. And all this isn't to say that you need to have a typical dating experience to take that next step in a relationship. But to me, this is a problem that we are ending the series with a proposal, but I never felt like the characters were actually a couple in the first place. There was tension in Yes 5 and Go-Go, but they were never an actual couple in either of those series, and the closest we got was a kiss under duress in Go-Go's movie. I don't know what they look like as a couple in the slightest, so when I'm sitting here and watching them get married, it just ends up feeling wrong to me. It also feels wrong to me that the series paints Coco like he was a very inspirational teacher to her for two reasons. For one, it just adds fuel to the fire of the student-teacher romance argument that people love to bring up. You can see my Yes 5 video for a rundown why I don't actually buy into that being what's going on in that season. And second, because it's just a complete retcon. When you look at what we had going on in Yes 5, we see Coco actually doing teaching so few times that you could probably count it on one hand. The whole point was for it to be an easy way for him to be in contact with his magic squad during the day before the hangout of the accessory shop was established. He was never really characterized as a teacher. The closest we got that there was one episode where he empathized with Nozomi when it came to her struggles with studying and helped her work through that. Even then, that wasn't treated like he was a teacher and more like he was a friend with a different perspective than her other friends that actually heard her out instead of outright deciding that she was a poor student. I suppose you could make an argument that he was her teacher in terms of the magical side of her life in the way that he lended support, but his actions in that realm were hardly any different than any of the mascots that came before them, and I would hardly categorize any of them as a teacher. Besides, the time she refers to him as one would generally be within the context of education. I don't know what it is about the series and wanting to have him positioned as a teacher in her life, but it's just not something that was actually a facet of the Yes 5 or Go-Go seasons. So to refer to him as such ends up feeling quite out of place. I want Nozomi to be happy, and if being happy means marrying Coco, then okay, whatever, fine. But I need to believe that's actually what's going to make her happy. And after the way the relationship was displayed in this season, I don't end up feeling like that's the case. She loves him, sure, but is he her one person? I don't know. These two were never characters that had a relationship defined by drama. They were always a little bland on the relationship front, so I don't know if we even needed to give them any strain in the relationship. People liked them with just some light tension between them, and that was it. Maybe in an alternate timeline, we got a version of this show where instead of all this, their relationship was just a bunch of jokes about how stupidly in love they are. The biggest problem is that for those who didn't like this relationship, the things that happen in this season are not going to win you over and might even make you think worse about a character involved. For those that do like it, you're going to walk away feeling underserved since there's not much to the two of them as a couple aside from a single shot of their wedding. It's a version of the pairing that just won't satisfy anyone. For those of you who haven't been here before, hello! Thank you for making it this far in the video. This is the part where we talk about how queer the season is because magical girls have a habit of being very gay sometimes. Now, historically, these sets of characters have been sort of hit and miss about this. Some of the things that seemed a little queer about the Yes 5 season all but vanished when time came for Go-Go, and let's face it, Saki and Mai, for all their hand-holding and the subtext that comes with it, are just a less married version of Honoka and Nagisa. That is to say, there is a space for reading those two as being more than friends, but I don't see it as much as some other pairs that we've had in the series. If you do though, more power to you, and have fun with those gals being pals. However, that doesn't mean we don't have anything to discuss with this. There are a few crumbs that I can sweep up into my dustpan and show you. One thing that the show continued with was the pairing of Karen and Kurumi, just like we saw toyed with at the end of Yes 5 and in Go-Go. This was never something that got a ton of focus in either of those series, but there was enough for people to notice it. A lot of it could be easily dismissed, but when one girl blushes when being praised by the other, well, that's some shipping fodder if I've ever seen it. The most substantial thing we get in this season, since the two of them don't get much solo focus, let alone a shared spotlight, is getting to see Karen dealing with a somewhat drunk Kurumi, taking her home to sleep and sober up, which gives us a scene that you can take as Kurumi being sleepy and comfortable enough to spill a secret, or one of those moments where a drunk person says their sober thoughts out loud that they might have otherwise wanted to keep secret. Which version you see is completely up to personal preference, but the information we get is the same either way. Kurumi has been shown to favor an appley drink when they're out at the bar, and that is indeed because it reminds her of the applesauce that Karen fed her when she was sick over a decade ago. Obviously, those events left a huge impression on her, leaving us to wonder if it's because it's one of the first times she was vulnerable with one of the other characters, or just maybe because she was specifically vulnerable and comforted by Karen. Oh, and she tells Karen she loves her. In case you're wondering, the specific word that was used, since Japanese has different levels of affection denoted by different words, was daisuki, which depending on the context and other factors can get translated as I love you or I really like you. So, not the most ironclad love confession in the world, but still cute nonetheless. And the other possible point of queerness in the season is when it comes to Mai. Now, she is definitely shown to at least date a man, but let's remember, the social pressures that can lead to compulsory heterosexuality are a thing. It could be very well that she dated him because that's sort of what's expected for her as a grown woman. However, given that the breakup she goes through isn't something that seems to affect her all that much and sets her more on the path of wondering if what she wants out of life is okay rather than wondering about her future prospects, I think there is definitely at least room to see this as Mai being potentially asexual, aromantic, or both. She doesn't seem to have a very strong drive to be seeing anyone at all, and that being out of the norm is what concerns her the most. Now, I think this was definitely intended to be about it being okay for her to want to focus on her career and herself at the moment. However, there is definitely room to read it this way, and it's a really fun angle to look at the episode through, since the whole thing ends up being a bit more of a queer story in the process, and makes the fact that Saki accepts her so readily as she is feel all the more meaningful. So, the term fan service has a bit of out of the norm definition in anime circles. Typically, when you see someone mention fan service in the context of anime, they're talking about something that is meant to be gratifying to fans in, well, a more carnal way. A lingering shot on a character's body, a certain outfit that an episode makes them wear. You know it when you see it. However, when I am talking about fan service here, I am talking about it more in the widely used meaning of the term. Something that is put into a piece of media in order to please the fans. Either because it's a little detail that just they would notice, it's something that they have been specifically asking to see, or a payoff to something that they've been waiting a really long time for. It may or may not be relevant to the plot, but it's there in an attempt to make the fans happy. So, for example, the moment in Avengers Endgame where, quick spoiler warning if you care about this movie, 3, 2, 1, Captain America gets to wield Mjolnir. There has been a sign or two that this was a possibility that had fans speculating about it for a long time, and even if you hadn't been part of that deeper speculation, it was just a really cool moment in the climax of the film. It was there to make the fans happy. The movie could have been written to function perfectly fine without that moment, since it was plot relevant, but not so important that pulling it out would cause the whole plot to collapse. But they chose to put it in there because they knew it was something that would get an excited reaction out of the fans. That is some fan service that works really well. Fan service is what it says on the tin. It's to service the fans and please them. And for something that is trading on a nostalgic feeling like Otona Precure is, it can be almost said that the show itself existing at all is an act of fan service. Yes, 5 is a season that people tend to think positively about, and it was one of the seasons that was really popular in Japan. However, it's a season that came out almost a decade ago and has mostly only maintained its relevance by being brought back into the series via crossovers. It's mostly existed as something that's a special treat rather than getting the spotlight itself. Add on the fact that sequel seasons are something that the series hasn't done in over a decade. And even then, there is no precedent for sequels that take place years after the fact with the cast grown up, and you can tell that this was really meant to be something that was made for the grown-up fans. And when you are making something purely for the fans, you're gonna want to throw some fan service in there. So I'd like to point out some small and large moments of fan service and talk about how well they do or don't work, because it's interesting how mixed of a bag this can be. We're not going to touch on everything because that would take forever, but we'll be touching on some of the more obvious examples that stood out to me. One of the things that works really well is the usage of sounds and visual cues that are a reminder of seasons past. The way that the transformations in this season were handled is something I don't want to get into just yet, since we'll talk about that later, but the fact that the same music was used was something that worked as a nostalgic hit. Even the music for the mid-episode eye catch is the same, even if the visuals aren't, tying us back into our memories of the original series. If you watched all of Yes 5 even once, you've heard that musical cue nearly 50 times, and there's no way you're not going to catch it. Having the voice actors back also really worked in the show's favor, especially since it was clear that they were doing a different take on things than before. Like, a lot of the voices do sound more grown up when they look like adults, but they slip back into that same teenage register when they get de-age, sounding just the way that they did before. And I should say it here, for all the complaints I might have about this series and the issues I think are on display, my hat is off to the actors who were involved here. They did a wonderful job that is worthy of praise. For another spot of good fan service, we get to see Kenta again, the boy from Splash Star who wanted to be a manzai comedian. He didn't make that dream happen, it seems, since he's now the owner of a bar that all the girls go to drink at in the evenings, but I don't think it's entirely a bad thing that he didn't make it. That is the reality for a lot of kids who might dream of some level of fame and fortune. It's really realistic that he might have ended up finding a different path in life, and he seems happy where he is now, which is great. He also got married to Yuko, which is a nice little detail. While Kenta always pretty overtly had a crush on Saki and Splash Star, that obviously never became a thing. However, one often less brought up detail was the way that Yuko clearly had a crush on Kenta when they were kids. You know what? Good for her. Get 'em, girl. These two are clearly really happy together, and they even have a cute little baby. So it was good to see them as a consistent background element of the series as one of the more recognizable sets of classmates from Splash Star. However, I think one of the worst handled cases in the spectrum of fan service was the way that things were done with characters from Futariwa and Max Heart. It starts when the characters go and get information from Honoka's grandma, which is a nice little cameo. It's one of those ones where if you don't recognize the character, it's fine because she blends in and can be easily read as just some older lady that lives just outside town. However, if you recognize her for who she is, it's very rewarding, but that's the best that these characters got. The first time that we see Honoka and Nagisa, it's shots of them talking to Honoka's grandmother that doesn't really show all of them, just parts of them. This is clearly meant to be something that is building for us to get excited for the prospect they might show up soon, but it comes with the unfortunate detail that this is handled in a really heavy-handed way. From what we see of these characters, their proportions seem to be fairly adult, but their outfits are basically carbon copies of what they wore as casual clothes back in the original series. This is obviously meant to be a visual shorthand, but for anyone paying attention, I think it would have been fairly obvious without having to put them in these outfits. When every other adult character has gotten some level of redesign and a new look, having these two be the only ones that didn't feels out of place. Like perhaps they were added in hurriedly enough that there wasn't enough time to put a lot of thought into their designs. And even if I logically know it's meant to be a visual cue for the audience, it feels extra out of place because I don't know any grown woman who dresses the same way they did in middle school. Even if you don't account for the way that you tend to outgrow these clothes, for women in particular, fashion trends change a lot over the course of even just 5 years. For me, for example, there are some things from high school I might still wear, but I spent most of high school in jeans and tees because I didn't care much for dressing up as a grimy little theater goblin. My level of variation was if I wore a sweatshirt or a flannel over the t-shirt. Even then, I'm pretty sure my tees had at least a 90% turnover rate since then. If I would go back to what I was wearing in middle school, it involved a tank top layered over a t-shirt. So it just feels really unrealistic to me that these two would be wearing the exact same clothing that they were wearing in middle school. Similar aesthetic? Yeah, of course, but not exactly the same. But it's a quick scene, so perhaps it's a little unfair to pay that much attention to it when it comes to this detail. The next time that we see Honoka and Nagisa, it's when they are already transformed since they drop right into the fight. This does keep us from seeing them transform, but I'm not too bothered by it since it's one of my least favored transformations, honestly. And at that point in the show, it would have just felt like they were using the transformation to eat up time in the middle of a battle. Definitely a pace killer. What is strange is that Hikari is nowhere to be seen. Granted, she wasn't in the scene with Grandma, but it feels really odd for her not to be there when she was part of their team for a whole season in the show. She's already got the dishonor of being only one of 2 lead girls without the Cure title in her name. At least let her take part in the fight, guys. But On some level, I get it. She was always more of a support character in terms of combat function, and the moment is the OG two characters coming in to very suddenly kick some major ass. However, I had put down in my notes wondering where she was by the end of the episode, and I was not the only person questioning it, judging by some of the reactions I was seeing online in the week that followed that episode airing. It might have helped a lot to have her at least running up in the background. But hey, she turns up next episode, and is literally there just to close the hole behind everyone once they get the monster out of the city and into the pocket dimension again. And if her being there just for that one function isn't bad enough, she closes it with herself on the other side, guaranteeing that she's going to be locked out of the final battle and kept out of the rest of the season. I don't want to say that this feels disrespectful, but it almost does. Kurumi might not have been getting a ton of story focus in the season, but at least she was around the whole time, got a tiny bit of a background plot, and got to take part in the final battle. Hikari got literal crumbs of involvement, despite also being a main character in one of the seasons of the show. But I get the feeling that the entire Max Heart crew might have been a late addition to the production timeline of the show. I can't prove it, of course. I am certainly not walking around behind the scenes at Toei, nor do I have any connections there, but these characters feel kinda superfluous. They could have very easily been cut without making too many changes, and they don't have that much impact on the series as a whole. They are really just there for a moment of fan service and to really make this Precure All-Stars the series. I hate to keep harping on the idea of what things could have been if the season had more episodes and was at least a 2-core order of 24, but once again, I think this is a case where that would have helped. Having these three join in episode 12 or 13 could have been a nice turning point for that form of the series. Instead, what we got was them showing up as little more than jingling keys in the audience's face. We don't even get to see them after the fight, so outside of one piece of artwork by Kamikita Futago, who works in the realm of the Precure manga, we have no idea what they actually look like. And we don't really know any other details about them as adults. There's a throwaway line that implies that Honoka and Nagisa work in conservation in some form, but there isn't a single detail for Hikari. The disrespect. And I understand the desire to have the three OG crews together again, like they were in the first crossover short that celebrated the 5-year anniversary, but it is a real shame that just when Splash Star characters were starting to get some attention without the OGs there to bring in discussions that drew comparisons between them, here come the OGs again just to satisfy fans. And I don't want to give the impression that this sort of fan service is without any merit. I mean, calling back to the very roots of a franchise is an important thing to do now and then. I would personally argue that they really liked calling back to Futariwa and Precure, but I can understand why. It was iconic in its own way, and the rest wouldn't exist without it. However, when I look at the examples of fan service that we talked about, it doesn't escape my notice that the fan service that has dual purpose is the fan service that feels more satisfying. The Max Heart characters showing up is really just there for the Max Heart characters to show up and make the fans happy. Which, if that's you, good on ya. Rock on, have fun. However, when we look at, for example, Kenta and Yuko showing up in this series, it is definitely there to please fans of these characters, but it also serves to build out the world of the series and give it more flavor. The girls could have gone to any bar, and it doesn't have to have background staff at it, but instead the choice was to make it a bar owned by known characters, giving us an impression of what they went on to do since we last saw them, while also creating a space that is unique to the series. It's not a totally bad thing to have fan service for the sake of it. When you are a fan, that can sometimes be fun, but it is important to make sure not to take it too far and have it overshadow other things that are going on. Having Honoka and Nagisa show up to fight is fun, but at the same time, having them swoop in and save the day does make the other characters feel weaker by comparison, and makes it feel like they couldn't handle things themselves without this force of Deus Ex Machina sweeping in to save them. It also kind of makes favoritism on the part of Toei pretty obvious. Okay, so maybe the subjects of production and continuity don't entirely go together, but they at the very least sit sort of adjacent to each other because these are things that are both a result of attention paid behind the scenes. So I don't think it's often helpful to be nitpicky about little details that don't really add to a series or detract from it that much. I think that the whole plot holding thing has really done a number on people's ability to engage with media that might not spell out every detail completely to them, or may have a detail where the reasoning or purpose isn't immediately obvious. Sure, I get into the weeds and the details in these videos now and then, but I try to be reasonable about it, or be clear when even I know my speculation is going a little bit too far or digging too deep into the granularity of things. However, there are some things that stood out to me and bothered me in terms of how this series handled its internal continuity and continuity with the seasons that came before it. So I hope you will allow me a small indulgence to just go over some of these aspects. First is a little thing, but when Kurumi transforms, she is able to basically immediately use her upgraded attack and magical item. However, this was always shown to be something that was granted to her with the help of Nuts and the magic crown, so this shouldn't be possible for her to do when he isn't around. It's a little detail and not all that important, but it was an early sign to me that this series might not be paying granular attention to the established lore of these characters, and sort of downplays the importance of Nuts in the creation of this item when his journey to make it was one of the most cohesive storylines in Go-Go. And this would have been an easy fix to just have her use the very similar non-upgraded version of the attack. That's literally what all the other characters do all season, which is why it feels strange that Kurumi was the only one this was done for. Really, it speaks to me of not paying much attention to her as a character in the same way that her lack of a focal episode does. Second, there is some revisionist history happening with Honoka's grandma and her story about living through the bombing of the town. Particularly, there has never been a clock tower in that story before this point. Whenever she talked about that period of time, it was always her talking about the hill with the tree on it. I know because she told this story more than once, and I found that funny enough to put in my notes for Futariwa and Max Heart. Now, obviously, this is the result of them needing to introduce the clock tower content for the sake of spelling out Belle's backstory to us, and using Grandma for the sake of doing that. But it did stand out as being personally funny to me as a big change in what Grandma usually talks about in that time period. However, I'm going to go easy on this because I think the idea was meant to be that the tree on the hill was her personal story, and the bell tower was really meant to be more about the town's story rather than hers. Flappy and Choppy are nowhere to be seen, despite the fact that Saki and Mai need them to be able to transform. I don't think they even get mentioned at all in the series itself, and I know this is likely because one of the voice actors passed away and would not be able to reprise the role. I believe Choppy hasn't spoken since then for this exact reason, no matter what the media, but it does feel strange that their mascots don't get to be in the series when all the ones from the Yes 5 and Go-Go era do. We're told that the Go-Go transformation item just kind of faded away and vanished for all of them after not using it for a while, but the transformation item of the Splash Star Girls was literally made from the mascots and they no longer have it, so it leaves me to wonder at what point they were separated from each other since they ended the season altogether as friends. The most we get is their faces silently showing up on the item when the girls transform, which is something that I'm sure feels out of place if you're not in the know about them. Really, it's the not mentioning them that gets me. I understand why you wouldn't if they're not going to show, but it also ignores that these characters were a really big part of Saki and Mai's life during their series. There's a moment where Michiru and Kaoru start streaming the final fight, which bothers me for a lot of reasons. When it causes this plot cul-de-sac of the people believing, then not believing, then believing again, that's enough to be an annoyance. But the other thing is that it was very clearly established early on in the season that the shadows could not be captured on camera in photo or video. I get that this is meant to be a special case, but I end up wishing that it wasn't, because it allows them to have that plot cul-de-sac by filming this thing. But also, the series ends with this streamed event fading from people's memory at what seems like an unnaturally rapid pace, so maybe they just didn't need to give the public the knowledge of it if it's not going to be treated like the world-shaking event that it would have been. It's just another case of one of those things that didn't need to be there and feels out of place with everything already established. And the last petty thing that doesn't actually matter, but I want to bring up, is the way that Hikari is so weirdly informed of Belle's whole deal. When she shows up and locks herself on the other side of the hole that she closes up, Belle is out there with her, and they have a brief conversation where Hikari makes statements that she would only make if she was completely caught up to speed on the whole Belle thing. However, because of the way she arrived so suddenly and how nobody would have had the chance to explain things to her in the meantime, it feels severely out of place for her to be having this conversation. Nozomi saying these things? Yeah, that would track. However, Hikari, girly, you just got here. Stand down. Like I said, these are all little petty things that maybe don't account for much in the long term, but when you are paying close attention, these things add up. When you have a series that already has problems, something that would otherwise be a footnote of an annoyance in a stronger series ends up feeling like it is a lot bigger of a problem than it actually is, potentially distracting you from what strengths the series does have. Another thing that can be a distraction is the way that the production values of a series are handled. Not every anime needs to be the prettiest and shiniest thing on the planet. Not every scene needs to have an animation cut worthy of making it in a Sakuga compilation. However, it can be a big boon to a series. Precure, at least from what I've seen so far, has always struck me as a series that knows when to use what it has and where to put its resources. Not every fight will be out of this world, but they are capable of pulling out all the stops when they need to. And if they're really careful, you can end up with something like Heartcatch, where it doesn't seem like there's really a bad fight in the bunch. Which is why it was so disappointing the moment I first saw the shadow monsters that the season was going to use for pretty much all the fights. They look really out of place due to the CG that was used to render them. And don't get me wrong, CG can be done well in anime, but it just isn't here. From the start, the way that they chose to texture these models makes them look like something that is more out of the early days of CG animation for television. Maybe not quite as early as the series reboot, but shortly after. There's just something uncanny about the texture that these creatures have and the way that they move that makes it never fully work. On one hand, it can be totally understandable to go for this effect to portray something that is completely otherworldly in a show. I could understand if that is what they were going for, but I don't think that was the intention here. Even if it was, it doesn't come across properly like that at all. Instead, the way it seems is that it was a quick, easy, and cheap way to copy and paste the same monsters over and over again in a scene. And I can also understand that to some extent. However, the end result is something a little opposite of what I think they were going for. These are the monsters of the series, but because of the way they handled them in production, these monsters never end up feeling like they are a threat in any of the episodes that they show up in. Because of the design and the way they're animated, their movements tend to feel slow and clunky, giving the impression more that they're bumbling at people rather than attacking them. And yes, that is likely because these are the lowest rung of monsters rather than the highest, but by the way they are framed in the episodes, these low-rung monsters are still meant to be something that we are perceiving as a threat to the characters and the general public. It can be hard to see them as any sort of threat when they don't even feel like they exist in the same world as everything around them. Compositing is something else that's a real big problem for these monsters most of the time. In essence, compositing is one of the many steps in the process of animation, making sure things like CGI elements blend in with the rest of the animation. The final polish that really makes everything come together. It's one of those things that when it's done really well, we don't tend to appreciate it all that much, but when it's done poorly, it becomes really obvious that something isn't quite coming together. One example that will always come to mind for me is the series Demon Slayer. It's a very well put together series and a real showcase for wonderful animation at times. It's also a showcase for some really great compositing, especially in the first season, where elements tend to come together really nicely. However, there are a few times where the compositing isn't quite as good, and those stand out like a sore thumb as a result, even more so in a series that usually has better compositing than what's on display in those moments that don't get it quite right. In Otona's case, the issue is coming from the compositing on these monsters that doesn't seem like it was done quite in the way it needed to be. The monsters are already somewhat out of place because their animation causes them to move differently than the rest of the characters on screen, but it becomes all the worse when the issue of compositing arises because it doesn't feel like they're existing in the same world as the rest of the characters, which makes what is going on less believable. Yes, there is always some level of abstraction that you have to accept when you are watching an animated show. You're never going to really believe that this is something that actually happened to anybody, because you can literally see that it is drawn characters and not real people. However, we tend to sometimes forget about that if a character and world feels real enough to us, if they're made believable in other ways. We, suspend our disbelief. However, when an element looks out of place like this, it takes us right back out of things, makes us sit up and pay attention to this odd piece, which draws us out of the experience. With how often the monsters show up, it's a shame that this happens basically every episode, and how we have fights with these characters isn't much better. Now, that's not to say that there aren't any good fights in this series. There are some moments that are pretty good. I might have mentioned it before, but Nozomi's first fight in the series is pretty nice to look at as a cathartic rampage, even if it doesn't last terribly long. Urara's fight in her focal episode isn't perfect, but the way that the music underscores her really helps give the thing a boost to make it feel like a powerhouse moment. When you contrast those against the rest of the fights in the season, though, some of them end up feeling really disappointing. Many of the fights this season end up being remarkably short. Precure fights don't tend to be lengthy ordeals in the first place, true, but the structure of a core season usually allows them to have some level of breathing room in most episodes. So when the ones in this season almost all feel shorter, that's notable. There was at least one where I ended up feeling like the stock animation that was used for the transformation of a character felt like it lasted longer than the fight itself. And I could live with that to some extent if the reason they were so short was because there needed to be more room in the episode for things like character beats, interaction, or development. Like, are we keeping the fight short because most of the episode is really focusing in on Karen's internal struggles and her changing relationship with the other girls because none of them can really understand the pressures of her job? Then it's fine to not have a lot of time spent on the fight. But I'm sure you've noticed that I've been a bit of a broken record saying that the characters aren't getting that sort of depth. When the character work isn't able to delve very deep, having the magical side of things be equally as shallow doesn't make for wholly satisfying episodes. And the cherry on top of this is that despite a tiny handful of these fights looking pretty good, many of them don't. When the fight isn't done away with just a quick flash of stock footage, what hand-to-hand combat we do get is pretty lacking. And I think some of that might come back around to the idea that the enemies this season are mostly repeated CG models. If the compositing is already not the greatest, you don't want to draw even more attention to that by having interactions between your two opposing sides that don't even look like they're landing those hits they're supposedly making. So we get a lot of quick moments that are clearly trying to dance around having to show these sorts of things. You have a lot of stuff where, for example, Nozomi goes in for the punch, only for the scene to cut, and instead of seeing the punch land, we just see the aftermath of the monster falling back onto the ground or into a bench or something like that. Now, this is not a new technique. This is something plenty of shows have used before. You show the build-up and the aftermath quickly, and the audience's brain sort of fills in the rest for them. Do it once in a blue moon, and while some might notice, the rest won't really pay it any mind. But do it more often than that, and people will catch on and notice. There's nothing wrong with the trick itself, but the issue lies with the fact that they overused it, and I start to notice it every time that it happened. And the overuse just feels like cutting corners after a while. I know well that making anime isn't the easiest thing in the world. It takes a lot of work from a lot of talented artists, and even the most talented person is going to end up having to cut corners if you put them on a hard deadline. Toei is a merchandising machine, and all those pipelines need to line up for their big launches of stuff, so you can't tell me there wasn't at least some level of a deadline on these people. Precure as a series is no stranger to stock footage, and Go-Go certainly was overusing it, don't get me wrong, but stock footage just feels more understandable in a season of nearly 15 episodes, and less so in a season of just 12. If you're having to kill time that way in a 12-episode season, it feels like you don't have enough substance to fill the thing without having to resort to these fluffers. There's definitely a time or two in my notes where I wrote down something about a fight being made of mostly panning images and stock footage. These should be tools we use to be able to free up time for other parts of the series, not the substance of the series itself. None of this is helped by the way that the series as a whole feels pretty standard modern anime. Like, don't get me wrong, the art direction here isn't bad or anything, but it's not doing anything unique to impress me either. This is meant to be a follow-up to Yes 5 on Go-Go, yet it didn't bother to bring the unique design elements of that season into this one. Now, I might not have been the personal biggest fan in the world of the way these two seasons did their backgrounds, but I acknowledge that that is fully a me thing, just not my aesthetic. However, one of the unique features of those seasons compared to the ones around them was that they had these interesting backgrounds. There was this almost pen-like quality to the line art that could make wide shots of the city look like something that had been doodled out in a notebook then filled in. It was something that was bespoke to those seasons and gave them their own visual identity. Otona doesn't seem to have bothered with doing that at all. Half the visuals of this season that don't have any characters in them look like they could have come from any number of currently airing anime. they just feel so standard. Clean city landscapes that make the city look clean and neat, as well as light highlighting on surfaces and characters. Sure, I wouldn't expect it to look like exactly the same thing as last time around with these characters. Techniques and such have evolved after all. But at the same time, it doesn't feel like there was any effort to visually tie this season in with its predecessors. Cutting corners sometimes is understandable. Everyone needs to do it eventually. But it's when the corners are cut crooked or too much that the audience starts to take note of it, starts to see through the workarounds and tricks, and starts to have a lesser experience. There's only so much you can cut into the margins of a page in a book before you start cutting away the text that's printed there. Okay, we've beaten around the bush long enough. Let's get into looking at those transformation sequences. Now, these are really nice in general, purely from the merit that they were really well made in the original series that they hailed from. They were good then, and they're good now. No shock there. However, from the moment the series was announced, there were questions as to how this was going to be handled. There were some people that thought the girls were never going to transform and that the entire thing was going to be more on the slice of life side of the spectrum, which, while I can understand the desire to see something like that, clearly that was never going to be the case. From the first poster that we got, a transformed Precure girl was faintly visible as a reflection under Nozomi. Sure, this could be seen mostly as symbolic of her past, but with hindsight on our side, we can see that this was meant to be a teaser that they were going to be doing some level of magical things in the series. And when I look at the poster, I do find it a little hard to tell what the silhouette is meant to be. With the context of having seen the series, it's pretty obvious that this is meant to be the transformed childhood Nozomi, but when I first saw the poster, it seemed like it could possibly be a silhouette of her transformed as an adult too. It was just kind of hard to tell. I admit, though, that I was a little disappointed when everyone started de-aging in order to transform and fight. Now, most of that was just because I was hoping to see some new designs that suited these newly adult characters, and was intrigued as to what the design sensibilities would be for an adult Precure. If they would stay the course, or if they would change things up. Maybe instead of having that somewhat uniform look that they've had for their 2 seasons, because they're adults and they've grown apart, their designs become more differentiated. Instead, we got the characters going back to their teenage bodies in order to transform into forms we had already seen them in plenty of times before. So we're left asking the question, was this for the sake of nostalgia, or for the sake of the production? I would argue that there is a little bit of both happening here, but for me personally, given the way that the whole series came together, it feels a bit like they had decided to reuse the old stock footage already, and the nostalgic hit it would provide would be an added benefit, even if that wasn't the initial reason to reuse this footage. And it's not like using these again is a wholly bad thing. I mean, it got us some beautifully crisp versions of these transformations. Given the age of the series, much of what you can find for these, at least stateside, can be a little bit crunchy at times, so it's good to see these girlies in their full glory on our screens again. That being said, though, the fact that we got this really tipped me off to the fact that these scenes were actually a reuse of animation. These look real good and blend nicely into the show, despite the way that there's been a good many years between these series coming out, so you may be tempted to think that they reanimated these transformations, but that's simply not the case, which is given away by the fact that they included the Splash Star girls and things. So, one of the fun things about a series that has gone on this long is you get to see some of the changes in television through the show itself. One big example is the way that the first 3 seasons of the show, Futariwa, Max Heart, and Splash Star, were all broadcasted in a different aspect ratio than the seasons that followed. They came out in the 4:3 ratio, but things didn't stay that way. The next year, when they hit Yes 5, the show started broadcasting in a widescreen format. This is a changeover that happened for a lot of media. When I was a kid, I distinctly remember there being 2 versions of DVD that you could buy for many popular movies. Widescreen or full screen meant to be a choice in how you were going to consume that movie. You could choose between the movie being on the whole screen but cutting off the edges to the left and the right in the full screen version. It, fills the screen. Or having the full widescreen view of your video with nothing cut off, but with black bars at the top and bottom to fill the empty space so the movie itself might look a little smaller on your screen. If you look at some American sitcoms from around the time, you can find some interesting things too. There are plenty of shows that were filmed in widescreen, also known as the 16:9 ratio, in preparation for the change to widescreen becoming a major broadcasting format, but then ended up broadcasting in the 4:3 ratio instead, or filmed in widescreen with the intent to bring it down to 4:3 in post-production. Sometimes these widescreen versions would be the ones that were released later on DVD, Blu-ray, or streaming, even if the show had originally broadcasted in 4:3. And when they released that way, people were seeing a new edge of the screen for the first time that they might not have been meant to see before. As a result, you can find plenty of cases where the show looked just fine in the 4:3 ratio, but in widescreen, a cameraman or the edge of the set got caught in a frame. It was meant to be cut out after the fact, but in releasing in the widescreen version, we are now able to see it. For example, if you look at this screenshot of widescreen Friends, you can see that they casually caught this big square hole in the set wall that is presumably there for some kind of camera purpose that wouldn't be visible if this frame is cut down to 4:3. Oops. So what does that have to do with Precure? Well, when something is animated, a show that is meant to be in 4:3 usually won't have a widescreen version too, like a live action show would have. When doing this in live action, cutting down a widescreen shot isn't really going to cost you anything extra. But with animation, that extra space on screen, if it's going to get cut off, is more that you have to fill with art, which means more work for your animators. So why put in that extra effort if nobody's going to see it anyway? However, that causes a little problem when it comes to the integration of Splash Star's transformation into Otona. If we presume that a widescreen version of Splash Star doesn't exist, which I think is pretty likely for the reasons I'm about to show you, then something would have to be done with the Splash Star footage to put it into the show. They need to make Splash Star's transformations suit the widescreen ratio like Go-Go's transformations do, otherwise it'll look really weird if the show suddenly changes to this old-fashioned aspect ratio just for a single transformation. So how did they do it? Well, maybe you can figure it out if I put them side by side, so take a look. So I don't blame people for not noticing this when they watch a show on its own, but when you put them side by side, it's pretty clear that the solution for making this widescreen was to just zoom in on the old transformation, rather than either figure out how to widen it out or reanimating it for that wider aspect ratio. And I get it, they're only going to show this transformation once in the entire show. Everyone has already seen it before, and it's possible to zoom in without this looking too terrible, so why not do it that way? But it's another place of cut corners. Even if I understand why it was done, it speaks to a lack of care, a lack of time, or both. It makes the whole thing feel a little cheap when you notice the way that Saki's fingers get cut off when she holds out her hand, or the way that Mai's ponytail slips off the top of the screen just a little bit in a way that feels off. While they understand the reasoning when I think about it, it's just something that, once again, feels like they're cutting corners in a way that leaves the show feeling cheap or underbaked. When looking at this, it becomes clear that the aged-down transformations were likely more for the sake of saving time or money, rather than going for that nostalgia bait. And it's fine to do something like that, but you have to put a little effort into everything around it so it doesn't feel like that was the reason you chose to do it. You see? There is a clock in the logo of the season, yet outside of the time flowers, hardly anything this season had to do with time at all. Sure, you can claim that Belle's motivation is a ticking clock and that she lives in a clock tower, but come on, that's a somewhat weak connection and we all know it. If the season had leaned harder into the theme of time and how time changes us, the reuse of their younger selves could have been something that was thematically resonant. But instead, it ended up being another one of those places where the series ends up feeling cheap. It's the little things, you know, and little things add up when you have enough of them. Looking at the series as a whole, it seems that this was perhaps not given quite as many resources as some of the main seasons get to have. And that makes sense to some extent. At the time this was made, it was a completely unproven concept. They had no clue if the idea of a Precure season meant for adults was going to be something that is popular. Sure, there are plenty enough adult Precure fans to support some pricier merch being made for them, but are they actually going to come out and support a series that is directly aimed at them? It's a case where it makes sense to be a little cautious about how much is getting put into it, But after looking at what we got, I have to say that I think the curse of Precure never having a truly great sequel season is still in effect. Max Heart is about on par with Futariwa, but fails to rise above it and can end up feeling really repetitive. Go-Go is just a downgrade in nearly every aspect, placing its characters in arrested development and spinning them in circles to justify another go-around. I was already worried about following up with characters that had already gotten 2 full seasons under their belt when this was announced, honestly. However, I had hoped that the adulthood aspect of everything would allow them to approach these characters from a new angle and keep them from feeling stale. And they did in a few places, but never enough that I felt like anything in this season was completely and fully fleshed out. Everything feels so rushed. Arcs are crammed into single episodes so we can make sure everyone but Kurumi gets one, and that means that a character isn't getting much screen time outside their designated episode unless they're getting involved as the best friend of choice for someone else. The production values make the show itself feel like it was something of a rush job. Even if this was an experiment of sorts, I would have hoped that they would have put more of a best foot forward. How am I to trust that the other adult sequel season that you have already announced is going to be good if you didn't show me that they can be with this one? Well, maybe if they focus just in on the season that is supposed to be a sequel of, instead of trying to pull in characters from other series like this one did with Splash Star, they can put a lot more focus on the characters, since I believe there should only be 3 of them. Pull off the first episode for reintroductions and the last 2 for a blowout finale, and you have enough left to give them 3 episodes apiece to form an arc. I know I sound like a bit of a broken record, but more time is really what this one needed. With this big of a cast, we needed more episodes for things to feel properly fleshed out and put together. I needed these girls to have time to breathe and develop. These rigidly regimented episodes where we are focusing in on one character at a time just wasn't something that worked. In a kids show with a lesson or problem of the week, that works because we're coming in on smaller problems that can be solved in just one episode. It makes each one feel like a full package and allows kids to steep in just a few concepts at a time. However, when you're making a show for adults, it can be more satisfying to see an arc play out in the long term. Allow the episodes to bleed into each other. Adults, if they're committing to a 12-episode series, are more likely to retain investment from one episode to another than a young kid might. Show us the problems of these characters building and crashing like a series of waves over the course of the season, rather than trying to make a wave happen each and every episode. Simply doubling the episode order for a production is no small feat. I'm aware that's a bigger investment of time, money, and talent, but it's something that could have really helped this season out. Some of the biggest issues are a lack of depth and a rushed timetable. Let the girls breathe and actually develop. Craft a plot that's a little more complicated for the adult audience that you're trying to court here. And maybe that's what frustrates me the most about this. This series is salvageable. The characters are still likable and I want to have fun with them, but that's hard when distractions about how the series is constructed keep sliding into view and pulling my attention away from the fun. This could have been fixed, but clearly somewhere along the line things started falling through the cracks and we were just trying to stay on the tracks after a certain point. I wanted to like Otona. I was excited for it. I am still working my way through Precure as a franchise, and I had hoped that I might be able to zoom my way through some of the seasons that are coming up so I could watch that magic season that's supposed to be getting that adult sequel. But now, I think I'll take my time. It can wait. I don't feel that pressure to work my way there quickly so I can watch that season, because Otona disappointed me, and I don't know how well it'll go anymore. I wanted to like this season. God, did I want to. But I can't. There's just too much flawed here. If you stuck around this long, wow, that's amazing. Congrats, you've sat through my biggest script to date, which only gets longer the more I go on, so I'll keep this short and sweet. If you like this video, consider subscribing and giving my other videos a watch. I really appreciate it as someone who both likes seeing numbers go up and would love the validation of managing to make it to 1,000 subscribers. If you want to support me more directly, I do have a Patreon, but you don't need to feel obligated. These videos take a lot of time and effort for me, and if you can afford to send a buck or two my way, I'd greatly appreciate it. If not, though, comments and likes do wonders for the algorithm and my ego. Thank you so much for watching.